There is a moment when you are deep enough underwater where the light from the surface becomes something else entirely. It stops being sunlight. It becomes a kind of memory. Pale blue, diffuse, moving in slow patterns across the seabed like the shadows of something that used to be there. Franck Goddio knows this feeling well. He has spent decades in that particular quality of light, hovering over harbour floors that no one had walked on in 1,000 years, watching his divers move between objects that had not been touched since the ancient world was still the present one. The year was 1996. The place was the eastern harbour of Alexandria, Egypt. The water was murky with silt and history. Goddio's team had spent years preparing for this, building detailed sonar maps of the harbour floor, studying ancient texts, cross-referencing the accounts of geographers dead for 2 millennia. And now they were here, in the water, above the place where the maps and the texts said something should be. And then the divers came up with a sphinx. Black granite. The features worn but unmistakable. The calm of a face that had been carved to outlast everything, and nearly had. It was lying on its side in the silt, the way things lie when they have fallen and the sea has closed over them, and there has been no one to lift them for a very long time. Around it, partly buried, partly exposed by the current, columns, statuary, the curved lines of a wall, the unmistakable geometry of a place that had once been built with purpose and had settled into the sea so slowly, so gradually that it still held its shape. They were hovering over the palace of Cleopatra. Not a monument to Cleopatra, not a site associated with her name by legend or loose tradition. The actual royal quarter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the complex of buildings where she had lived, worked, and made the decisions that would change the ancient world. It had been beneath the water for more than 1,500 years, and it was still there, waiting as ruins wait, with the particular patience of things that have nowhere else to go. This is the story of what went under the sea and what the sea kept safe. The year is 1996. The diver's name is Franck Goddio. He has been searching for this for a long time, searching with the patience that this kind of work requires, the patience of someone who believes that the historical record points to a specific place, that the specific place is findable, that the finding of it will be worth the years of preparation and funding and navigating the institutional permissions that surround an excavation of this kind. He has his sonar, he has his team, he has the eastern harbour of Alexandria, which has never been systematically excavated, which has been sitting under the waves, with whatever it contained since the earthquakes of the 4th and 8th centuries lowered the ground level and the sea filled the space that had been dry land. He goes down, and what he finds, in the cold green water, in the silt that has accumulated over 15 centuries, in the stillness that is the opposite of everything Alexandria was in its living years, is a sphinx. Its face is intact. Its headdress is broken but present. It lies on its side where an earthquake threw it, where the silt received it, where it has remained for all the time since. The Ptolemaic sphinx with its calm eyes open, looking at nothing, in the dark water of a harbour in which the ships no longer come. That is where we begin tonight, in the dark, in the cold, in the 30 feet of water that separates us from the world that built these things and used them and lost them and does not know, 2,000 years later, what the sea has kept. Settle in. Let whatever you're carrying tonight rest beside you for a little while. You don't need it right now. The Mediterranean Sea is not a quiet place, even in memory. It is one of the most written about bodies of water in human history, crossed and recrossed by Greeks and Phoenicians, Egyptians and Romans, merchants and pilgrims and armies for more than 5,000 years. Civilizations rose on its shores and named their gods after its storms. Poets described its colour. Navigators memorized its winds. It has more stories than any sea has a right to hold. But there is one thing about the Mediterranean that almost no one talks about, which is how much of it is still down there. When people think about lost cities, they tend to think of jungles. They think of Angkor Wat reclaimed by roots, or Machu Picchu emerging from cloud forest, or some buried temple slowly revealing itself to the careful brush of an archaeologist. Land hides things through overgrowth, through sediment, through the slow accumulation of soil over stone. We understand that kind of hiding. We have a shape in our minds for it. The sea hides things differently. It doesn't just cover them, it seals them. The cold water, the silt, the lack of oxygen in the deeper layers, these create conditions where things are preserved rather than destroyed. Timber holds its shape. Ceramics survive intact. Stone structures maintain their walls, their floors, their proportions. The sea is, in a sense, a better museum than anything we have built on land. And along the coast of the Mediterranean there are dozens of ancient cities beneath the water. Some were swallowed by earthquakes that dropped whole sections of coastline into the sea. Some were drowned by the slow rise of sea levels as the last ice age melted away over thousands of years. Some were taken by tsunamis so enormous they are still visible in the archaeological record, layers of sea sediment found miles inland, mixed with the shattered pottery of people who had no warning. Some were abandoned as harbours silted up and the trade routes moved on, and then the sea moved in behind them as the land subsided. They did not all go down at once. They went down one by one over centuries, and the sea closed over each of them with the same slow indifference. Tonight we're going to visit some of them. The city of Alexandria, or rather the part of it that went under the water in the centuries after Rome fell, is the most famous. The royal quarter, the palace complex, the famous Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, standing at the harbour entrance for nearly 1,500 years before earthquakes brought it down into the sea. All of that is still there. Goddio's team has been excavating it for nearly 30 years, and the site is still yielding things. But Alexandria is not alone. Off the coast of southern Greece, in shallow water so clear you can see the bottom from a boat, lies Pavlopetri, the oldest known submerged town in the world. 5,000 years old. Its streets are visible from above. Its buildings still have their walls. It was ancient before the Parthenon was built, ancient before the Trojan War, ancient before the alphabet, and it has been sitting under 12 feet of water, undisturbed, for 3,000 years. In the waters near the Egyptian coast there is an entire city that was not even known to exist until the year 2000. Thonis-Heracleion, the primary port of ancient Egypt, the gateway through which nearly all trade between Egypt and the Greek world passed for 600 years. Its name appeared in ancient texts, Herodotus mentioned it, inscriptions referenced it, but no one had ever found it on land, because it was never on land. Not for the last 12 centuries. It went under during a series of earthquakes and floods, and then the sea swallowed the memory of where it had been, and the world simply forgot it was there. An entire city, forgotten, recovered from the seafloor 2,000 years after it sank. These are the places we'll be moving through tonight, gently, slowly, in no particular hurry. There's no urgency to this kind of exploration. The cities have been down there for a very long time. They can wait a little longer while we look at them carefully. If you enjoy documentaries like this to fall asleep to, subscribe. I post a new mystery like this every week. Let the weight of the day go. You're somewhere quiet now. The light is low, and under the sea, a few thousand feet below the surface of this story, an ancient world is waiting to be found. The thing that is peculiar about the cities under the Mediterranean, the quality that distinguishes them from buried cities, from sites abandoned and overgrown on land, is the nature of their preservation. Land sites are preserved by accumulation and decay. Things get covered by soil, by other buildings, by the debris of later occupation. But the covering process also involves exposure to air, to water moving through the soil, to the organisms that break down organic material, to the chemical processes that dissolve and transform and alter everything that is not stone or metal. What survives on land tends to be the most durable materials: stone, fired clay, metal. Wood rots, rope disintegrates, cloth disappears, the seeds in the storage jar decay. The record that land sites preserve is a record filtered by these processes of decomposition. The sea filters differently. What goes into the sea and is quickly covered by fine silt in cold, anaerobic water enters a different kind of preservation environment, one in which many of the processes of decomposition are slowed or stopped. Wood survives in these conditions for millennia. Rope survives. Seeds survive. The more complete organic record that the sea preserves is not a secondary bonus of underwater archaeology. It is one of its primary contributions to our understanding of the ancient world, the recovery of materials that are simply not available from land sites, the completion of a picture that would otherwise be permanently incomplete. The cities we are going to visit tonight are not the only submerged cities in the world, or even in the Mediterranean. They are the ones whose stories I find most vivid, most richly documented, most instructive about what the ancient Mediterranean world was actually like. But they are also representative of a much larger phenomenon, the worldwide distribution of coastal settlements that went under as the sea level changed and the land shifted, a distribution that extends far beyond the Mediterranean into every sea and every ocean, and every coastline where people have lived close to the water and been taken by the water in the end. There is a quality of slowness that underwater archaeology requires, a slowness that is not just physical, not just the consequence of working in water instead of air, but that is also intellectual. The evidence is fragmentary in specific ways, and reading it requires a kind of patience that resists the narrative shortcuts that make history easier to tell. You cannot rush the Sphinx, you cannot hurry the silt. The past gives up what it gives up on its own schedule, in its own order, and the work of understanding it has to follow that schedule and that order. This is, in a sense, the discipline that the sea imposes on everyone who works in it, and it is a discipline that, on a quiet night like this one, with the harbour still and the dark water moving slowly over the stones, seems not like a constraint but like a gift. Alexander the Great arrived on the Egyptian coast in 331 BC in the way that Alexander arrived at most places, with an army at his back, a purpose in his chest, and a speed of movement that left everyone around him slightly breathless. He had already conquered Persia. He had taken Syria and Palestine. Egypt opened to him almost without resistance, its people welcoming him as a liberator from Persian rule, its priests crowning him pharaoh in a ceremony that dated back thousands of years. He was 24 years old. He stood on the low promontory between the sea and the inland lake, on a stretch of Egyptian coast that had been, until that moment, essentially unremarkable. A small village called Rakotis, a narrow strip of limestone, a natural harbour formed by a long thin island called Pharos, sitting offshore like a breakwater placed there by accident. And Alexander looked at it and said, "Here." The story has the quality of legend because so many things about Alexander have that quality. The line between what he did and what people later needed him to have done is not always easy to find. But the core of it is true. He chose the site himself. He is said to have sketched the outline of the new city in grain or chalk on the ground, laying out the lines of the main boulevards, the position of the harbour, the location of the royal quarter. The birds ate the grain before he was finished. His seers told him this was a good omen. The city would feed many nations. He left almost immediately after that. He went east, deeper into Asia, into the campaigning that would consume the rest of his short life. He would never return to Alexandria. He would die in Babylon at 32, and his body would eventually be brought back to the city that bore his name, a city he had never seen completed, never walked through as a living man, never stood in the centre of and understood what he had started. What he had started was something the ancient world had never quite seen before. Alexandria was not built to serve an existing population. It was not the organic growth of a fishing village or a trading post or a military camp that had been there long enough to accumulate the weight of habitation. It was planned from the beginning as something specific, a capital, a meeting point between the Greek world and the Egyptian world, between the Mediterranean and the Nile, between the sea routes of the west and the land routes of the east. It was designed to be, in a phrase that the ancient world would eventually use without irony, the first city of the world. The man who actually built it was not Alexander but Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, the one clever enough to claim Egypt when the empire was divided among his successors, and shrewd enough to understand what Alexander had started and how to finish it. Ptolemy was not a visionary in the way that Alexander was a visionary. He was, if anything, the opposite, careful, methodical, patient, the kind of man who understood that the greatest ambitions require the most meticulous foundations. He read the site that Alexander had chosen, and understood why Alexander had chosen it. The harbour was the key. The harbour and the position, Egypt's Nile wealth behind it, the entire Mediterranean world in front of it, the island of Pharos providing natural shelter from the northern storms. Ptolemy and his descendants, the Ptolemaic dynasty, would rule Egypt for 300 years, from Alexander's death in 323 BC until the death of the last of them, Cleopatra VII, in 30 BC. 3 centuries of a single family presiding over a city that grew, in that time, into perhaps the greatest metropolis the ancient world would ever produce. 3 centuries is a long time. It is longer than the United States has existed. It is long enough for a city to grow from a plain scratched in grain on a limestone promontory to a city of 500,000 people, long enough for a library to accumulate the knowledge of the entire ancient world, long enough for a lighthouse to become legendary. At its height, Alexandria had a population somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, depending on which ancient source you trust. That made it possibly the largest city in the world, larger than Rome for much of its early history, larger than any city in Europe or the Near East, a size that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. It covered an area of roughly 10 square miles, laid out in a grid that the Greek urban planner Hippodamus would have recognised and approved of. 2 main boulevards crossed at the centre, each wide enough, ancient sources say 30 metres, that modern historians describe them as closer to parade grounds than streets. On either side of these boulevards, lined with columns that shaded the pavements from the fierce Egyptian sun, were the shops and houses and public buildings of the greatest city in the world. The city had 2 main languages, Greek and Egyptian, and the relationship between them is one of the most interesting cultural phenomena of the ancient world. Greek was the language of power, of administration, of the court and the law and the upper classes. Egyptian was the language of the mass of the population, of the temples, of the countryside beyond the city walls. The Ptolemaic rulers spoke Greek among themselves and Egyptian to their subjects, or tried to. Most of them did not bother to learn Egyptian. Cleopatra, at the end of the dynasty, was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually master the Egyptian language, which tells you something both about her intelligence and about the remarkable indifference of her predecessors to the people they ruled. The city had everything. It had the Great Harbour, actually 2 harbours, the Great Harbour to the east and the Eunostos Harbour to the west, separated by a causeway called the Heptastadion that connected the mainland to the island of Pharos. The name Heptastadion means 7 stadia, a stadium being a unit of measurement of roughly 185 metres, so the causeway was roughly 1.3 kilometres long. It divided the sea between the mainland and the island into 2 harbours, each with its own entrance, its own facilities, its own character. The Great Harbour was the royal harbour, the prestigious one, the harbour where the largest merchant vessels and the warships of the Ptolemaic navy moored. The Eunostos, the name means good return, a sailor's good luck name, was the commercial harbour, busier and noisier and smelling more strongly of pitch and fish. The royal quarter, the Bruchion, occupied the northeastern corner of the city along the Great Harbour's waterfront. This was not a single building, but a complex of buildings spread across what ancient sources describe as a quarter to a third of the entire city. Palaces, gardens, pavilions, private harbours, a zoo, a mausoleum where Alexander's body was displayed, temples, and the museum and the library. The scale of it is difficult to hold in the imagination. A quarter of the largest city in the world, devoted to the residence and the leisure and the intellectual pursuits of a royal court. That is perhaps 2.5 square miles of palace grounds, garden, and royal architecture, all of it facing the sea, all of it positioned to assert the wealth and power of the Ptolemaic dynasty to every ship entering the harbour. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous thing about the city, and also, in some ways, the most misunderstood. People imagine it as a single grand building, a repository of knowledge, destroyed in a single catastrophic fire by Julius Caesar, or Arab invaders or some other memorable villain. The reality was stranger and more interesting. The library was actually 2 institutions, the main library, attached to the museum in the royal quarter, and the daughter library, housed in the Serapeum temple complex in another part of the city. They were not just collections of books, they were something closer to what we would call a research university. Scholars living on the grounds, supported by royal patronage, pursuing mathematics and medicine and astronomy and literature and geography, competing and collaborating in a way that made Alexandria, for several centuries, the intellectual capital of the Western world. Euclid did his geometry here in the 3rd century BC. His Elements, 13 books laying out the foundations of geometry as a logical system, was probably composed in Alexandria, probably in the museum, in the scholarly environment that the Ptolemies had created and funded. Archimedes, who calculated the value of pi and invented the principles of the lever and the pulley, may have studied here as a young man. Eratosthenes, who served as chief librarian for several decades in the 3rd century BC, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of a shadow in a well at Syene, modern Aswan, and the distance to Alexandria, and a mind capable of making the necessary deductions. His result, roughly 40,000 kilometres, was off from the true figure by about 2%. Herophilus and Erasistratos performed the first systematic human dissections here in the 3rd century BC, establishing the foundations of anatomy in a way that would not be significantly advanced for over 1,000 years. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system here, the idea that the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the reverse, 2,000 years before Copernicus made the same proposal and was celebrated for it. The ancient world was not ready for Aristarchus's idea. It was filed away, noted, not quite refuted but not accepted, and the city that produced it moved on to other things. The Pharos lighthouse stood at the eastern tip of the island of Pharos, connected to the city by that long causeway. It was completed around 280 BC, during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and it was, by the accounts of everyone who saw it, extraordinary. Most ancient estimates put its height at between 100 and 140 metres, which would make it among the tallest structures ever built in the ancient world, surpassed only by the pyramids at Giza. It had 3 sections, a square base, an octagonal middle, and a circular top crowned by a statue, probably of Poseidon, god of the sea, or possibly of the Ptolemaic ruler who commissioned it. At the very top was a fire kept burning through the night, and a system of mirrors that reflected and amplified the light outward across the dark Mediterranean. Ancient sailors reported seeing the Pharos from 50 miles at sea. Some ancient accounts claim the beam was visible at even greater distances. Whether or not those distances are accurate, and ancient sources are not always reliable on precise measurements, the basic fact is clear. The Pharos could be seen far out to sea, in conditions where no other navigational aid was available. For a sailor on a moonless night, far from any coast, making for the harbour that controlled the greatest trade route in the ancient world, the light of the Pharos would have been the most important thing in the sky. It told you where you were going. It told you that Alexandria was real, that its harbour was open, that the world you were heading for was still there. By 1600 BC, or rather by roughly the 3rd century AD, Alexandria began very slowly to go under the water, not metaphorically, literally. The northeastern section of the city, the Brucheion, the royal quarter, the palace complex began to subside millimetre by millimetre, over decades and then centuries. Earthquakes tilted the limestone shelf, tsunamis drove seawater across the harbour front, the sea level rose by inches, by feet. The land sank beneath the weight of what it carried. Building by building, street by street, over the course of several centuries, the ancient city was swallowed by the harbour it had once overlooked. By the 8th century AD, the royal quarter was gone. The Pharos had collapsed into the sea, a series of earthquakes between the 4th and 14th centuries, bringing it down in stages, the last remnants visible on the harbour floor, until the Sultan Qaitbay built a fortress on the same site in 1477, using some of the lighthouse stones in his foundations. The palaces were underwater, the gardens were underwater, the mausoleum where Alexander had lain in his crystal sarcophagus, underwater, the private harbour of Cleopatra, underwater. Everything that had made Alexandria the first city of the world was at the bottom of the bay, where it still is, where it has been waiting in the cold dark of the eastern harbour for someone to come and find it. The plan that Alexander scratched in grain on the ground, the plan the birds ate and that the seers called a blessing, became, in the end, a city built for the sea, and the seers kept it. And the choice of Alexandria's location was not accidental. Alexander had a gift for site selection, an eye for the geographical logic of a place that went beyond what was visible on the surface. The strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the sea offered something that was genuinely rare in this part of the Egyptian coast, the potential for a harbour on both sides. To the north, the Mediterranean and the great sea routes that connected Egypt to Greece and to the wider world. To the south, the lake, which connected via canal to the western branch of the Nile, which connected to the interior of Egypt, to the agricultural heartland, to the other cities, to the source of the grain and the papyrus and the linen and the other goods that Egypt produced in surplus and that the Mediterranean world wanted. A city that could receive ships from the north in its Mediterranean harbour and send goods south through its lake harbour had a structural advantage over any rival site. Goods moving between the Mediterranean world and the interior of Egypt did not have to be transshipped at a coastal port and then moved overland or by river separately. They could flow through Alexandria continuously, harbour to harbour, in and out in both directions, the city taking its toll on each transaction. The harbour fees, the customs duties, the storage charges, the handling fees, all of these accumulated in Alexandria's treasury as the goods moved through. The Ptolemies understood this, and they invested in making Alexandria's harbour infrastructure match its geographical advantages. The great harbour was protected by the island of Pharos, which lay a short distance offshore, and Ptolemy I connected Pharos to the mainland with a causeway called the Heptastadion, 7 stadia long, roughly 1.3 kilometres, that created 2 separate harbour basins, one on either side of the causeway. The eastern harbour, which became the Royal Harbour, was more sheltered and was used by the Royal Navy and for official purposes. The western harbour was the commercial harbour, the working harbour, where the merchant ships came and went in their hundreds. The physical scale of what the Ptolemies built is staggering when you try to reconstruct it. The Heptastadion alone was an engineering project of considerable ambition, a causeway more than 1 kilometre long, wide enough to carry traffic, with bridges at intervals to allow water circulation between the 2 harbour basins. The harbour walls, the quays, the warehouses, the customs houses, all of this infrastructure had to be built from scratch on a site that had been a modest fishing village before Alexander arrived. The labour, the materials, the logistics, the expertise required to build a city of this scale, on this timeline, were marshalled by the early Ptolemies with an efficiency that reflects both their resources and their determination. The ethnic geography of Alexandria in its early centuries was complex in ways that are worth dwelling on, because it shapes the character of everything that was produced here. The city was divided into districts, and the districts had distinct populations. There was a Jewish quarter. Alexandria's Jewish community was one of the largest in the ancient world, and the Alexandrian Jews played an important role in both the economic life of the city and the intellectual life of the museum. It was in Alexandria that the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek, the Septuagint, produced according to tradition by 72 scholars in 72 days, a legend that reflects the importance attached to the project. There was a district associated with the Egyptian population. There were quarters associated with the various communities of Greek settlers from different parts of the Greek world. These communities were not hermetically separated. They interacted constantly, in the marketplace, in the courts, in the intellectual life of the museum, in the religious syncretism that the Ptolemies actively encouraged. A Greek scholar at the museum might be in regular contact with Egyptian priests who preserved ancient astronomical knowledge. A Jewish merchant might be in commercial partnership with a Phoenician trader and conduct their business in Greek, the lingua franca of the Hellenistic world. The city was a mixing environment in a way that few ancient cities were, and the mixture produced things, intellectual things, cultural things, that would not have been produced anywhere else. Franck Goddio came to underwater archaeology from an unlikely direction. He was a statistician. He spent the early part of his career working for the French government on development projects in Southeast Asia, the kind of work that requires patience, meticulous data analysis, and a tolerance for working in places where the conditions are difficult and the outcomes are uncertain. None of this is bad preparation for archaeology. It is, in fact, almost ideal preparation for the kind of archaeology Goddio would eventually do. The skills are the same: the ability to build a picture from incomplete data, the willingness to sit with uncertainty for a long time before drawing conclusions, the discipline to document carefully what you find and resist the temptation to claim more than the evidence supports. He became fascinated by shipwrecks in the early 1980s, and then by the broader question of what was preserved beneath the seafloors of the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. He founded the Institut Européen d'Archéologie Sous-Marine in 1987, assembled a team of divers and scientists and conservators and specialists in ancient history and marine geology, and began systematic surveys of harbour floors and coastal zones that had received little scientific attention. When the Egyptian government granted him permission to survey the eastern harbour of Alexandria, he had already spent years developing the technology and methodology that would make the work possible. He had spent years, too, reading everything the ancient sources had written about Alexandria, everything modern scholarship had produced about the city's geography and layout, every medieval Arab account of the ruins before they went completely under. He came to the harbour knowing in considerable detail what he was looking for. The challenge of underwater archaeology in a busy ancient harbour is different from the challenge of excavating on land, and different again from working in deep water on a shipwreck site. The eastern harbour of Alexandria is shallow, 10 to 30 feet in most places, but it is also turbid, churned by boat traffic and by the currents that move through the harbour entrance and across the harbour floor. Visibility is often poor. The seabed is covered in centuries of accumulated sediment, silt, sand, the remains of fishing activity, the debris of 2,000 years of a functioning port city operating on top of the drowned ruins of a much older one. You're excavating underneath a living city. You're working in the shadow of an ancient one. The two things are pressed together, the modern harbour noise above you, the ancient harbour silence below, and you are somewhere between them, in the murky water, looking. Goddio's team began with sonar, side-scan sonar that mapped the harbour floor in extraordinary detail, building up a picture of what lay beneath the silt without disturbing it. The sonar works by emitting pulses of sound sideways from the survey vessel and recording the echoes as they return from the seabed. Different materials, soft sediment, hard rock, archaeological structures, reflect the sound differently, and the pattern of reflections builds up into a map. The resulting images are not photographs. They are more like topographic maps, showing the shape and texture of the seabed in grayscale. But they are extraordinarily revealing. Walls show up as linear features. Column bases show up as regular circular forms. The grid of an ancient street plan shows up as a pattern of straight lines, intersecting at right angles, unmistakably artificial, unmistakably architectural. They also use sub-bottom profilers that could penetrate the sediment and indicate the presence of hard structures below. The profiler sends a pulse of sound through the water and into the seabed. The sound passes through soft sediment and reflects off harder materials buried beneath, stone walls, packed earth floors, the compacted debris of collapsed buildings. The reflection returns to the surface and is recorded. The profiler cannot tell you what the buried structure is made of or what it was used for, but it can tell you it is there, how deep it is, and roughly how large it is. This allows the team to identify priority areas for diving investigation before any diver goes into the water, a crucial economy of effort, because diving time in the turbid, boat-trafficked harbour of Alexandria is expensive and limited. The sonar maps, when they came back from the first systematic survey of the harbour floor, showed something that was almost overwhelming in its implications. The harbour floor was not empty silt, it was structured. Underneath the sediment were walls, pavements, column bases, harbour moles, the remains of buildings laid out on a regular grid. The royal quarter had not been randomly destroyed and scattered by the earthquakes and the submergence. It had subsided largely intact. The earthquakes had tilted and dropped whole sections of the city into the sea, but they had not shattered them beyond recognition. The buildings were still there, in something like their original positions, preserved under 10 feet of water and several more feet of silt, waiting in the particular dark of a harbour floor for someone to find them. The divers went down in 1996, the first diving season of what would become the longest sustained underwater excavation in the history of Mediterranean archaeology. They went down in wetsuits, in the murky water of the eastern harbour, with lights and cameras and measuring tapes and the sonar maps laminated and attached to their equipment boards. They were looking for structures that the sonar had indicated should be there, in certain areas of the harbour floor at certain depths. They found them. The Sphinx was among the first significant objects. Black granite, roughly a metre long, the face worn by the water and the sand and the centuries into something softer and more indistinct than it was originally. But the form was unmistakable. The broad face, the headdress, the powerful haunches, the forward-facing gaze that had been looking at the harbour floor for 1,500 years instead of at the sea it was built to overlook. The style dated it to the period of the Ptolemaic dynasty, probably the reign of one of the early Ptolemies, Ptolemy I or II. But a sphinx, however impressive, was not specific enough on its own. There were sphinxes all over Egypt. The question was whether the context, the location, the other objects around it, the architectural remains it lay among, could be linked to specific buildings described in ancient texts. It could. Over the years of excavation that followed, Goddio's team recovered objects and identified structures that allowed them to map the royal quarter with increasing confidence. They found column bases still in their original positions, the stones smoothed and grooved where the shaft of the column had rested. They found sections of harbour wall, the massive limestone blocks still in their courses, the mortar between them still intact under the water. They found the remains of what appeared to be a temple platform, its dimensions matching ancient descriptions. They found dozens of sphinxes, each one slightly different styles, different periods, from the New Kingdom era of Egyptian history, predating the Ptolemies by 1,000 years, through to the late Ptolemaic period. The Ptolemies had decorated their royal quarter with ancient Egyptian statuary, drawing on stores of old objects from earlier periods to lend their Greek-built city the weight of Egyptian antiquity. It was a deliberate strategy. If you rule Egypt, you claim its history. They found statues, colossal statues, and a torso of a Ptolemaic king in red as one granite, over 5 meters tall when reconstructed. A colossal head, also in red granite, believed to represent a Ptolemaic queen, perhaps Arsinoe II, the sister and wife of Ptolemy II, who was deified in her own lifetime and worshipped throughout the Ptolemaic kingdom. The scale of these objects is worth pausing over. A statue that is 5 meters tall when complete, taller than a double-decker bus, lying on the harbour floor, invisible from the surface, visible only to divers with lights in water of limited visibility, undiscovered for 15 centuries. The ancient world made things on a scale that is difficult for the modern imagination to hold. These were not decorative objects. They were assertions of divine power, meant to be seen by everyone entering the harbour, meant to say, the people who built this are not like you. They stand with the gods. They found the remains of what Goddio believes may be the Timonium, a structure built by Mark Antony after his defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. The ancient sources tell us that Antony, having lost everything, his alliance with Cleopatra, his war against Octavian, his last desperate hope of recovering his position, withdrew from the city and built himself a small pavilion on a promontory in the harbour, where he intended to spend the remainder of his life in the manner of Timon of Athens, the legendary misanthrope who retreated from humanity after being betrayed by it. Antony told his friends he wanted nothing more to do with the world. He had roughly a month to live when he said this. He died by his own hand when Octavian's forces entered Alexandria in 30 BC. But the structure he built, or began to build, may be there, on the harbour floor, in the area that Goddio's sonar maps have identified as a potential match for the location described in the ancient texts. And then there is the matter of Cleopatra herself. Cleopatra VII was the last of the Ptolemies. She was not, despite what films have sometimes suggested, Egyptian by blood. She was Macedonian Greek, a descendant of the general Ptolemy who had claimed Egypt from Alexander's divided empire 3 centuries before. But she was the first of her dynasty to bother learning the Egyptian language, a fact recorded by ancient sources with what reads like mild surprise and considerable admiration. She spoke 9 languages in total, according to the historian Plutarch: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Ethiopian, the language of the Medes and the Parthians and the Jews and the Arabs. She was educated in philosophy and rhetoric in the Greek tradition. She was also, by the accounts of those who dealt with her, one of the most politically intelligent rulers the ancient world produced. She ruled from the royal quarter that Goddio's divers are now excavating. The buildings they are mapping, the palace complex, the harbour structures, the temple platforms, were the buildings she inhabited, the spaces she moved through, the view she had from her windows across the harbour toward the island of Pharos, and the lighthouse that stood at its tip. When archaeologists recover a fragment of marble flooring from the harbour floor, they are touching something that she walked on. Not metaphorically, the actual physical surface, the stone that bore the weight of a woman who shaped the history of 2 continents and altered the trajectory of the ancient world. One of the most significant recent finds from Goddio's excavations is a large granite stele, an inscribed stone pillar, recovered from the harbour floor and bearing a decree from the reign of Nectanebo I, an Egyptian pharaoh who ruled 4 centuries before Cleopatra in the 4th century BC. The stele is inscribed with hieroglyphs and Demotic script, and it confirms the location of a specific ancient sanctuary, the Sanctuary of Heracleion, dedicated to the god Heracles identified with the Egyptian god Khonsu. This stele is one of several pieces of documentary evidence that have allowed the team to identify particular areas of the harbour floor with particular buildings named in ancient sources, cross-referencing the physical object with the ancient text in a way that gives confidence to the interpretation. The excavation is ongoing. Goddio's institute brings divers to Alexandria every year, working in the turbid water of the eastern harbour, recording and recovering and carefully logging everything they find. The pace is necessarily slow. Underwater archaeology cannot be rushed, and the site is vast. After nearly 30 years of work, the team estimates they have investigated perhaps a third of the submerged royal quarter. Another section of ancient Alexandria remains under the water of the modern city's western harbour, not yet systematically excavated. And still more lies under the modern city itself, under streets and apartment blocks, and the ordinary life of a city of 5 million people going about its business on top of what may be the most extraordinary buried city in the world. What went under is still there. The question of what it can still tell us is one that may occupy archaeologists for another century, and there is something quietly extraordinary in that. The idea that one of the greatest cities of the ancient world is still yielding its secrets after 30 years of systematic investigation, still speaking to those who have the tools and the patience to listen. The patience required to work in that water, in that visibility, with those maps and those questions, is a particular kind of patience. It is the patience of people who understand that the answers are there, in the silt, in the cold dark of the harbour floor, and that the silt will give them up, in its own time, to hands careful enough to receive them. The positioning system that Goddio's team uses, EVA software combined with acoustic transponders anchored to the harbour floor, allows them to locate every find to within about 10 centimetres of its actual position in 3-dimensional space. This sounds like a technical detail, and it is, but the implications are significant. When you can record the precise 3-dimensional position of every object, you can reconstruct the spatial relationships between objects, which things were found near which other things, how the distribution of one type of object relates to the distribution of another. These relationships are not just interesting in themselves, they are the primary way that the function of a space is recoverable from its archaeological remains. An example. The distribution of certain types of pottery within the royal quarter tells you something about which parts of the quarter were used for storage, which for cooking, which for dining, which for ritual. The pottery types are not identical across the whole excavated area. They cluster in ways that reflect the original organisation of the space. Where you find the large storage amphorae, there was a storage area. Where you find the fine tableware and the serving vessels, there was a space where people ate and drank. Where you find the ritual vessels and the votive objects, there was a sacred space. None of this can be recovered from a survey that records only what was found, not where it was found. The spatial data is as important as the object itself. Goddio himself has spoken in interviews about the moment when the archaeological picture of the royal quarter began to come into focus, when enough data had accumulated that it became possible to see not just individual objects, but the structure of the whole area. The outlines of buildings began to emerge from the distribution of column bases and wall fragments. The path of streets became visible in the negative spaces between building remains. The orientation of the whole complex, the way it was laid out in relation to the harbour, the way the main axis of the royal quarter pointed toward the sea, became clear when enough points had been mapped to allow the overall pattern to be perceived. The relationship between Goddio and Cleopatra is, in a sense, the relationship between the present and the past that all archaeology enacts, but it is more vivid in this case than in most. Goddio has spent 30 years looking for the traces of someone who died 2,000 years ago, in a place that is now 30 feet underwater, in a palace that was already ancient when she lived in it. He has found things that were certainly in her world, the column bases of the palace, the harbour walls her ships departed from, the statues that stood at the harbour entrance that she would have seen every time she came and went. He has not found her, no inscription with her name, no personal object certainly attributable to her, no room that can be identified as specifically hers. The archaeology has not produced Cleopatra. It has produced the world she lived in. There is a lesson in that about the nature of archaeological evidence and the nature of historical understanding. We know Cleopatra from the ancient texts, and those texts are unreliable in specific ways. They were written by her enemies, mostly, or by people who had inherited her enemies' versions of events. They present her as a seductress, a manipulator, a dangerous foreigner who corrupted the noble Romans who fell under her spell. Modern historians have worked hard to recover a different picture, a highly educated, politically skilled ruler who governed Egypt competently for more than 20 years in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The archaeology does not directly contradict or confirm either picture. It gives you the harbour she looked out at, the palace complex she worked in, the city she governed, and from that physical reality, you can begin to imagine the life that was lived inside it, not the legend, but the thing itself. In the ancient sources, the city appears by name but never by location. Herodotus mentioned it in the 5th century BC, the historian who has been called the father of history, the man who travelled the ancient world collecting stories and observations and recording them in a style so vivid that 25 centuries later people still argue about which of his claims are reliable. He said Helen of Troy had stopped at Heracleion with Paris on her way to Egypt, which is mythological shorthand for very old and very significant. Diodorus Siculus mentioned it. So did the geographer Strabo. Several inscriptions referenced it by name. There were traditions about a great temple of Amun there, one of the most important religious sites in Egypt, the place where every ship entering Egypt from the Mediterranean was required to stop and pay its dues to the priests in the treasury. Egyptian pharaohs came to Heracleion to receive the blessing of Amun before they were formally crowned. The city was called Thonis by the Egyptians and Heracleion by the Greeks, two names for the same place, each name reflecting the cultural tradition of the people using it, in the way that cities in regions of mixed cultural heritage often acquire multiple identities depending on who is doing the naming. It sat at what had been one of the mouths of the Nile, the Canopic branch, now dry, which once drained north into the Mediterranean near the modern coastal city of Abukir. For roughly 600 years, from around the 7th century BC to the 1st century BC, it was the primary maritime gateway into Egypt. Every Greek merchant who wanted to trade with Egypt came through Heracleion. Every ship carrying goods from the Mediterranean world into the Nile Valley, the tin and timber and wine and olive oil and silver that Egypt needed and could not produce itself, had to pass through Heracleion's harbour, pay its duties, declare its cargo, receive its permission to proceed. The city was also a religious centre of the first importance. The ancient Egyptians were not a people who separated the commercial and the sacred with any great firmness. The Temple of Amun at Heracleion was, in the period of the city's greatest prosperity, one of the wealthiest and most influential religious institutions in Egypt. Ships came to Heracleion not just to trade but to worship, to make offerings at the temple, to seek the blessing of the god before a long voyage, to fulfill vows they had made in danger at sea. The relationship between the harbour and the temple was not incidental. It was structural. The temple blessed the trade enriched the temple. The city existed in a sense in the space between the two. And then, at some point between roughly 200 BC and 700 AD, it went under. Not all at once. Earthquakes, floods, the slow liquefaction of the deltic soil on which it had been built. The entire city descended into the sea, and the sea closed over it, and the memory of where it had been was lost so thoroughly that by the time modern Egyptologists began piecing together the geography of ancient Egypt, they were not entirely sure Heracleion and the city the Egyptians called Thonis were even the same place. They were fairly sure they were. The same location was implied by the texts, the same time period, the same general description. But no physical evidence connected the name to a specific site. The city had simply disappeared. Then, in 1999 and 2000, Goddio's team was surveying the waters of Abukir Bay, about 30 kilometres east of Alexandria. They were looking for something else entirely, the remains of Napoleon's fleet, sunk by the British at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, one of the most decisive naval battles of the Napoleonic Wars. The sonar was scanning the seabed in the shallow bay, building up its map of the bottom, registering the echoes from the sediment and whatever lay beneath it. and the seabed looked wrong. Not empty wrong. Structure wrong. The kind of wrong that experienced sonar operators learn to recognize. The pattern of returns that indicates something artificial beneath the sediment, something built by human hands, something that was not put there by geology or tides. The team adjusted their survey. They went back over the same area. The same pattern appeared. Linear features, regular spacing, the geometry of walls. The divers went down, and what they found was not a fleet of 18th century French warships. What they found was an entire ancient Egyptian city, lying on the seafloor in 20 to 30 feet of water, spread across an area of roughly 11 square kilometres. Streets, temple complexes, harbour installations, hundreds of anchor stocks, the heavy stone or lead weights that stabilised ancient anchors, dropped by vessels mooring in the ancient harbour and never recovered, lying where they fell on a harbour floor that was no longer a harbour but a seabed. Steely statuary. Coins, thousands of them, in bronze and gold and silver. Pottery from across the Mediterranean world, Greek amphorae, Cypriot storage jars, Egyptian storage vessels, all the material evidence of a city that had been for centuries one of the busiest ports in the known world. It was Thonis-Heracleion. The discovery confirmed what the ancient texts had implied but never proved, that the Greek name and the Egyptian name referred to the same city, and it confirmed something that the ancient sources had suggested but that no physical evidence had previously supported, that this city was not a small port town but a major urban centre, substantial enough to have had a grid of streets, multiple temple complexes, distinct residential and commercial districts and harbour facilities capable of handling the volume of traffic that the ancient texts described. There is a practical reason the city was so thoroughly forgotten. It was built on the deltic mud of the Nile estuary, not on rock or stable ground, but on water-saturated sediment that is inherently unstable. Ancient builders in the delta knew this and built accordingly, using timber piles driven into the mud and careful foundations to distribute the weight of their buildings. But deltic soil is subject to liquefaction. Under earthquake stress, it can behave momentarily like a liquid, losing its structural integrity as the water in the spaces between soil particles takes on the load that the solid material was carrying. When the earthquake passes and the soil resolidifies, everything built on top of it has shifted or sunk. This process, combined with gradual subsidence over centuries and the periodic catastrophe of major floods from the Nile, is what took Thonis-Heracleion under. The people who lived there had time to leave, at least for some of the events that preceded the final submergence. You can tell this from the archaeology. The large objects, the statues, the temple columns, the storage vessels, the furniture of civic and religious life remain in place. But the small portable valuables, the things a family would take when they had time to pack, the jewellery, the small bronzes, the money, are largely absent from the residential areas. What remains is the infrastructure, the civic and religious architecture, the permanent fixtures of a city that were too heavy to carry away and too embedded in the ground to pull up. The people went. The city stayed. What the divers found in the central part of the city was a large temple complex, the Great Temple of Amun-Gereb, one of the most important religious sites in Egypt for the entire period of the city's occupation. The temple itself did not survive intact. Its columns and walls have collapsed, scattered across the seabed in the slow disarticulation that comes with earthquakes and with the weight of time pressing down on structures that are no longer maintained. But the layout is still legible. The orientation of the fallen columns tells you the direction of the temple's axis. The position of the column bases tells you the dimensions of the hypostyle hall. The location of the sanctuary block, the innermost room where the god statue was kept, can be identified from the pattern of the architectural debris. This was not a minor provincial temple. This was a major religious centre, which is consistent with everything the ancient texts said about Heracleion, that its temple was wealthy, powerful, and visited by the entire Mediterranean world. The sanctuary finds are among the most striking from the site. Within the collapsed remains of the innermost sanctuary, divers found a large black granite naos, a shrine, a box-shaped container in which the statue of the god was kept, closed and sealed, opened only on specific ritual occasions. The naos is inscribed with hieroglyphs recording the names and titles of the pharaoh who dedicated it, and with text describing the god and the rituals performed in his honour. It weighs several tons. It has been lying on the harbour floor for more than 2,000 years. It is in extraordinary condition. The hieroglyphs are as sharp and legible as when they were carved. Perhaps the most striking single category of find from Thonis-Heracleion is the collection of ancient boats. 69 ancient vessels have been discovered in the port area, ranging from small riverboats to large seagoing ships. This is an extraordinary number. No other ancient harbour site has yielded anything close to it. The boats are remarkably well preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the harbour floor. Wood survives, though fragile and requiring careful conservation treatment to prevent it from crumbling when it is exposed to air after 2,500 years of immersion. Hull planking, keel timbers, frames, all of it visible, all of it datable by dendrochronology and carbon-14 analysis, all of it telling the story of ancient Egyptian and Greek boat-building traditions, and how they intersected in a city that was the meeting point of the two maritime worlds. One of the boats, a large vessel roughly 28 metres long, is of a type known from Egyptian illustrations but never before found physically. It is a flat-bottomed riverboat of a kind used for transport on the Nile, adapted for use in the shallow coastal waters of the delta. It has pegged planks without a keel, a form of construction specific to the Nile tradition rather than the Mediterranean tradition. Mediterranean ships have keels because Mediterranean waters are rougher and require a hull that can be driven through waves. Nile boats have flat bottoms because Nile waters are calmer and require a hull that can navigate shallow channels. Finding a Nile-type boat in the harbour of a city that sat at the junction of the two worlds is a reminder of how thoroughly Heracleion was a place of exchange, not just of goods, but of technologies, traditions, and ways of moving through the world. The finds from the temple area include a collection of over 300 objects specifically associated with the annual ceremony of the Mysteries of Osiris, one of the most important religious events in the Egyptian calendar, held in the month of Khoiak in late autumn, involving elaborate ritual performances, the fashioning of figurines representing the dead and resurrected god, and ceremonial processions by boat across the waters of the sacred lake or harbour associated with each major temple. Small bronze figurines of Osiris and Isis. Ritual pottery vessels used in the ceremony. Fragments of inscribed stone recording the ceremonies to be performed and the words to be spoken. The ash of incense burned in the temple precincts during the rituals. Reading them, or rather reading the translations of the hieroglyphic and demotic inscriptions on the stelae and the naos and the ritual vessels, is like receiving a letter from a city that had forgotten anyone could still listen. The words are still there, in the stone, in the sediment, in the memory of a place that the sea has kept. One discovery from Thonis-Heracleion deserves particular attention because it bridges the Greek and Egyptian worlds in a way that no single artifact from a land site could. A large stele recovered from the harbour floor is inscribed on one face, with hieroglyphs, and on the other with Greek text, a bilingual monument, the Egyptian and Greek versions of the same decree placed back to back in the same stone. This was a common practice in Ptolemaic Egypt, where the administration operated simultaneously in both languages and official documents were issued in both. But finding such a stele here, in the harbour of the primary port of entry for Greek trade into Egypt, reminds you viscerally of how completely Thonis-Heracleion was a hinge between two worlds. The person who commissioned this stele understood that it would be read by Egyptians who knew only hieroglyphs, and by Greeks who knew only the Greek alphabet, and they provided for both. The religious life of the city was correspondingly hybrid. The great temple of Amun-Gereb was an Egyptian temple, built and staffed by Egyptian priests, conducting its rituals in the ancient Egyptian tradition that stretched back thousands of years before the first Greek ship arrived in the harbour. But Heracles, the Greek hero whose name gives the city its Greek name, was also worshipped here, identified with the Egyptian god Khonsu in one of those theological syntheses that the ancient Mediterranean world was skilled at producing. When a Greek sailor arrived in Heracleion, he came to a harbour whose principal temple was dedicated partly to his own tradition's greatest hero, whatever Egyptian name the god wore. That cannot have been an accident. It was a deliberate piece of religious diplomacy, a way of making Greek visitors feel that the harbour they were entering was also theirs, that the god of the harbour knew them and would hear their prayers. There is a stillness to the site now that is hard to reconcile with what it once was. The sonar maps show structure, the geometry of streets and buildings and harbour walls, The divers move through water that has replaced the air that once filled these spaces. The temple court that was once crowded with worshippers, the harbour that was once loud with the voices of merchants and sailors and customs officials, the streets where donkeys carried goods from ship to warehouse. All of that is now 30 feet of water and 15 centuries of silt. The noise is gone. What remains is the architecture of the noise, the spaces that noise inhabited, the stone shapes that organised it. The scale of the city, when you try to hold it in the imagination, is considerable. 11 square kilometres. To put that in perspective, that is an area larger than many modern town centres, larger than the historic core of many European cities that are still inhabited and functioning and considered significant places. And this city was unknown, not just unexcavated but completely missing from the map of the ancient world, until 1999. An entire city, larger than the historic centre of many significant modern places, hidden under 30 feet of water in a bay east of Alexandria, until someone ran a sonar over it and found the streets. What does that suggest about what else might be down there? If a city of this size, with this level of significance in the ancient sources, could be completely lost until the very end of the 20th century, what else is under the Mediterranean that we have not yet found? The answer to that question is, genuinely, not known. We do not have a complete inventory of the ancient cities that existed around the Mediterranean coast. We do not know how many of them were coastal enough to be affected by sea level rise and tectonic subsidence. We do not have a systematic survey of the coastal waters that would reveal what is there. We have specific investigations at specific sites, driven by specific historical questions. Thonis-Heracleion shows what those investigations can find when they look in the right place. It also shows that there are right places that no one has thought to look. In the summer of 1967, a British oceanographer named Nicholas Fleming was snorkeling in the shallow waters off the southern coast of Greece, in the region called Laconia, near a small bay called Vatica. The water was warm and clear. The northern Mediterranean in summer is as legible as glass in the shallows, the seabed visible through several metres without any difficulty. Fleming was doing what oceanographers do, a survey of coastal geology, mapping the way the coastline had changed over thousands of years, the evidence written in the bedrock and the sediment and the position of old shoreline features now visible only from below the surface. He looked down and saw streets. Not the suggestion of streets, not geological formations that might have been mistaken for streets by an imaginative eye, not the kind of ambiguous shapes that can be found on any rocky seabed and that wishful thinking can sometimes resolve into patterns that were not intended. Streets, the regular lines of walls, the perpendicular intersections of pathways, the outline of what were unmistakably building foundations, all of them lying in about 3 to 4 metres of water, close enough to the surface that the late summer light came through clearly and illuminated everything with the particular quality of clarity that shallow Mediterranean water provides. The stones were cut limestone, local stone. The walls had not collapsed randomly. They had collapsed along lines that preserved the plan of the buildings they had formed. He surfaced. He floated for a moment in the warm water, looking at the sky, and then he went down again, because what he had seen required looking at again before it could be believed. It was still there. The streets, the walls, the intersections, everything in the same place, still legible, still unmistakably a town. He had found Pavlopetri. The name comes from the tiny islet nearby, and it means nothing more than the Chapel of St. Peter, the kind of small, specific, geographically descriptive name that Greek places accumulate over the centuries, each one a layer of history deposited on an older one. There was no ancient name attached to the submerged site, or if there was, it had not been preserved in any text. The town appears in no ancient source. No poet mentioned it. No historian recorded it. No inscription referenced it. It simply existed, was lived in for thousands of years, and then went under the water somewhere around 1000 BC, and was not seen again for nearly 3000 years. Nicholas Fleming published his findings. Cambridge University conducted a more detailed survey in 1968, sending divers down with measuring tapes and drawing boards to produce the first plan of the site. The plan showed roughly 15 distinct buildings along with streets, courtyards, and what appeared to be a communal space of some kind in the northern part of the town. It was published in the archaeological literature. It received attention. It was noted as a remarkable discovery. And then, for 40 years, Pavlopetri was largely left alone, noted, documented in outline, but not systematically studied. The technology of the 1960s and 1970s was not adequate to do more than sketch the site's outline, and the funding and the institutional will for a major project were not assembled until much later. It was not until 2009 that a full survey project began, led by the University of Nottingham in collaboration with the Greek Ministry of Culture and the Effort of Underwater Antiquities. The project used technologies that had become available in the intervening decades: digital underwater mapping, three-dimensional photogrammetry, a technique that uses overlapping photographs to construct accurate three-dimensional models, side-scan sonar, the kind of tools that allow an archaeological site to be documented with extraordinary precision and completeness without being physically disturbed. The team spent multiple seasons at the site, building up a three-dimensional model of every visible structure, mapping the position of every artifact on the surface of the seabed, and attempting to understand the chronology of the site's occupation and abandonment. What those surveys revealed was something that pushed the known age of the site back far beyond what the 1968 survey had suggested. Pavlopetri is not just a Bronze Age Greek town, the kind of thing that can be found at dozens of sites across the Aegean, the visible remains of the culture that produced the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the traditions of hero worship that the classical Greeks would later elaborate into their mythology. Its origins go back to the early Bronze Age, to approximately 2800 BC or earlier. That makes it roughly 5,000 years old. It is, as far as current evidence indicates, the oldest submerged town ever found anywhere in the world. Think about what 2800 BC means in the context of what else was happening in the world at that moment. The pyramids at Giza had not yet been built. The Great Stepped Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the world's first large stone structure, was still several centuries in the future. The Minoan civilization on Crete was in its earlier stages, its palace culture still unformed. The Greek city-states that would eventually produce the world of Socrates and Pericles and the Parthenon were 3,000 years in the future. The Roman Empire was 28 centuries away. The alphabet did not yet exist in any form. The earliest alphabetic writing systems would not appear for another 1,500 years. And yet here was a town, with streets, with multi-room buildings laid out on a regular plan, with storage facilities for goods that were traded across the Aegean. Pottery finds at Pavlopetri include Minoan wares from Crete and material from the Cycladic Islands and from mainland Greece, suggesting that even in this early Bronze Age phase, the town was connected to the broader Mediterranean world, participating in the networks of exchange that would eventually, over 2 millennia, produce the civilization we call Classical Greece. Pavlopetri was part of that story from the very beginning. Not an outlier, not a remote provincial backwater, but a participant. A town that bought and sold and traded across the sea, that knew something of what lay beyond its own harbour, that was, in some small way, already connected to the wider world. The survey identified approximately 15 distinct buildings in the main area of the site, along with courtyards, gardens, inferred from the distribution of soil samples and plant remains, rock-cut tombs on the periphery, and what appears to be a cemetery. The streets run between the buildings in patterns that suggest deliberate planning, not the organic growth of a settlement that simply accumulated over generations, each new building going wherever there was space, but something laid out with intention, with a logic of access and movement and spatial organization. There are features that look like storage pits, dug into the seabed or into bedrock, for keeping goods cool or preserving food. There are what appear to be cist graves, small stone-lined chambers used for burial, visible in several locations. The buildings themselves are varied in size and layout. Some are single rooms, possibly workshops or storage spaces, the practical spaces of a working community, unadorned, functional, used for the making and keeping of things rather than the living of a domestic life. Others have multiple chambers connected by doorways, the kind of arrangement that suggests a household, different rooms for different activities, spaces for sleeping and for cooking and for receiving visitors, and for storing the accumulated possessions of a family that has lived in the same place long enough to accumulate them. The walls are built from local limestone blocks, cut to shape and laid without mortar, in a technique common across the Bronze Age Aegean, relying on the weight and careful fitting of the stones to hold them in place. Some of these walls are still standing beneath the water to a height of 1 or 2 courses, not the full height of the original wall, but enough to preserve the plan. There is one feature of Pavlopetri that deserves particular attention, and it is not a building or a street or an artifact, but a room. A single room in the northern part of the site, identified by the 2009 survey team after careful analysis of the architectural remains. The room is long and narrow, roughly 12 metres by 5 if the reconstruction of the collapsed walls is correct, and its proportions, its size, and its position within the town suggest to the researchers that it may be a communal meeting hall or administrative space. Buildings of this type, known as megaron in the architectural terminology of the Bronze Age Aegean, are associated with the palatial culture of the Mycenaean period on mainland Greece. Finding what may be an early version of this building type at Pavlopetri, at a date that precedes the Mycenaean palaces by 1,000 years or more, suggests that the administrative and social structures we associate with Bronze Age palace civilization may have roots in much earlier, simpler settlements like this one. The implication is interesting because it suggests that civic organization, the idea of a communal space separate from individual households, a place where the community as a whole could gather, where decisions affecting the whole town might be made or ratified, is not a late development in the story of human settlement, but an early one. Even in a town of perhaps a few hundred people, in the 3rd millennium BC, there was apparently a need for a space that belonged to everyone, that was not a house or a temple, but something between the two. What went under Pavlopetri was not a catastrophe, at least not a sudden one. The evidence suggests a gradual submergence over a long period, possibly over many generations, possibly over centuries. The sea level in the Mediterranean has risen by roughly 3 to 4 metres over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, due to a combination of actual sea level rise as glacial ice melts and local tectonic subsidence as the seabed adjusts to the slow movements of the plates beneath it. The site was probably occupied into the late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 to 1000 BC. And then, as the coastline changed and the water rose, the town was gradually abandoned, building by building, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, until the sea had taken it entirely. The people who left Pavlopetri did not leave in a panic. There is no evidence of a sudden catastrophe, no destruction layer, no sign of hurried abandonment. They left over time, over generations probably. Children grew up knowing their parents had moved inland from a coast that was no longer safe to build on. Grandchildren heard about buildings that were now underwater at high tide. Great-grandchildren perhaps had no memory of the town at all. Just the vague shape of a story, a place that was once there but was now gone. The memory fading as memories do, becoming softer and less specific with each generation that did not need to hold it clearly. That gradual fading is in some ways the most poignant aspect of Pavlopetri's story. Not the fact that it went under the water, but the fact that it was so thoroughly forgotten. Other Bronze Age sites were destroyed, burned by invaders, abandoned in the upheavals of the late Bronze Age collapse, but they left traces in the landscape, ruins visible above ground, material that later people could see and wonder about, and sometimes incorporate into their own mythology. Pavlopetri left nothing visible. It was simply under the water in the shallow bay, close to the surface but out of sight for 3,000 years. And now it is visible again. In 3 to 4 metres of water, in the clear light of the Mediterranean summer, the streets of a 5,000-year-old town are legible to anyone who looks down from a boat or paddles over them on a snorkel. The walls are there, the rooms are there. The life that was lived in them, the cooking and sleeping and trading and child-raising and dying of a Bronze Age Aegean community, is not there, not directly. But the shape of it is, the form that the life took, the built environment that held it, and that is in the end something. The material culture of Pavlopetri, the objects that have been found on and around the site, tells a story of a community that was connected to the broader Bronze Age Aegean world in ways that seem remarkable given the site's remote location on the southern tip of mainland Greece. Minoan pottery from Crete, the distinctive fine wares of the Minoan civilization, with their characteristic decorative motifs of marine life and flowing botanical designs, appears in the assemblage alongside local Laconian pottery and material from the Cycladic islands. This distribution of pottery types is not what you would find at a site that was primarily self-sufficient, that traded only with its immediate neighbours. It is what you find at a site that was participating in a broader exchange network, one that connected the southern Greek mainland to Crete and to the islands, and to whatever lay beyond them. What did Pavlopetri trade? The answer is not entirely clear from the archaeological evidence, because the things most likely to have been traded, agricultural products, raw materials, perhaps specialised craft goods, are precisely the things least likely to survive in the archaeological record in a way that allows their provenance to be identified. Grain leaves no trace except sometimes charred seeds. Olive oil in a local storage vessel looks like locally produced olive oil. Only chemical analysis can sometimes distinguish the oil of different regions. Textiles are gone entirely, but the presence of imported pottery from regions that were not in the immediate vicinity, implies the existence of trade connections, and trade connections imply the existence of goods worth trading. The coastline around Pavlopetri in the Bronze Age would have been different from the coastline today. The sea level was lower. The bay that now floods the site was shallower, or in parts may have been dry land. The inlet that now forms the immediate setting of the site may have been a more sheltered anchorage than it appears today, offering protection from the open water swells of the Laconian Gulf. The site's position at the southern tip of the Mani Peninsula, the middle finger of the three peninsulas that form the southern Peloponnese, would have made it a natural stopping point for ships moving between the eastern and western Mediterranean, between the Aegean world to the north and the shipping lanes around the Peloponnese to the west. The Bronze Age mariner's world was one of coastal hopping, moving from anchorage to anchorage, rarely venturing far from visible land, navigating by the shape of the coastline and the position of recognisable peaks and promontories. A town at the tip of a recognisable peninsula, in a sheltered bay that could be identified from sea, was a natural waypoint. Ships coming around the Mani would stop here for water, for provisions, for the chance to hear news from other ships and other ports. The town existed partly in that intersection, between the sea routes that passed it and the land resources that surrounded it, and the life of the town was shaped by both. After the town went under the water, the life of the area continued, different, smaller, shaped by the changed coastline. Fishing communities replaced the Bronze Age town. The Laconian coast, rocky and rugged and not particularly productive agriculturally, has always been a marginal environment, and the people who lived along it have always been defined partly by the sea. The village of Pavlopetri, the modern village that gives its name to the ancient site, sits above the bay where the ancient town is submerged. The people who live there are the descendants, at several thousand years' remove, of people who have always lived on this coast. They were not aware, until 1967, that an ancient town lay beneath the water of the bay they fished in and swam in and looked at every day. The discovery was not expected. It was the result of one specific person, swimming in one specific body of water, looking down at the right moment. The Pharos of Alexandria is counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one of those wonders that served a practical function. The pyramids were tombs, built to house the bodies of dead kings for eternity, not designed to be useful to the living in any immediate sense. The Colossus of Rhodes was a statue of a god built as a thank offering for military victory. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were, depending on which historian you consult, either elaborate decorative terracing built by a king for a homesick queen, or possibly fictional, a legend elaborated from a smaller truth. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was a cult image. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus was a place of worship. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was another elaborate tomb. But the Pharos was a working lighthouse, built to solve a specific practical maritime problem. The Egyptian coast north of Alexandria was dangerously flat and featureless, with no natural landmarks to guide ships into the harbour, and the harbour approach itself was a maze of shallows and sandbars that required skilled navigation, and it solved that problem not for a decade or a generation, but for roughly 15 centuries. Nothing else built by the ancient world lasted as long in active use. The Roman Colosseum stopped hosting gladiatorial combat after only 4 centuries of use. The Parthenon was converted to a church after 9 centuries, and a mosque after 14. The Pharos stood at the entrance to Alexandria's harbour, burning its fire, reflecting its light, guiding its ships, until sometime in the 14th century AD, nearly 1700 years after it was built. 1700 years is a span of time that is difficult to render in human terms. It is longer than the entire span of recorded European history from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the present day. It is the distance from us back to the age of Justinian doubled. It is longer than the interval between the building of Stonehenge and the present day by several centuries. In those 1700 years, the Roman Empire rose to its full extent and fell. Rome itself was sacked repeatedly. Christianity spread across the known world. Islam was founded and spread across the Middle East and North Africa. The Crusades happened. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population. The Renaissance began. The printing press was invented. And through all of it, the Pharos stood and burned its fire and told ships where the harbour was. It was built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, completed around 280 BC. The architect was Sostratus of Cnidus, a name that has survived because of a story told by Lucian, the 2nd century AD satirist, who claimed that Sostratus was so proud of his creation that he inscribed his own name on the foundation stones and then plastered over it, carving a dedication to Ptolemy in the plaster, knowing that the plaster would eventually wear away and his own name would be revealed. The foundation inscription, according to Lucian, read, Sostratus of Cnidus, son of Dexiphanes, to the saviour gods, on behalf of those who sail the seas. Whether or not this story is literally true, and Lucian was a writer more interested in a good story than in strict accuracy, it captures something real about the Pharos and its builder. The lighthouse was, in a sense, dedicated to the sailors who needed it. It was built on behalf of those who sail the seas, not on behalf of a king, not as a monument to Ptolemaic power, though it was that too, but as a service to the people who navigated the dangerous Egyptian coast in all weathers and needed to know where the harbour was. That the architect understood this and wanted his name associated with that service rather than with royal flattery says something about him. The lighthouse stood on the eastern tip of the island of Pharos, connected to the mainland by the Heptastadion, the 7 stadia causeway. The island itself was occupied by a substantial settlement, military installations to protect the harbour mouth, facilities for the lighthouse keepers and the supply of fuel for the fire, storehouses, temples, the ordinary infrastructure of a permanently inhabited offshore station. Standing at the far end of that causeway, looking out to sea from the lighthouse's base, you would have seen the Mediterranean opening up before you, and any ship approaching from the north would have seen the lighthouse before they saw any other part of Alexandria. Ancient descriptions give the height as somewhere between 100 and 140 metres. There is considerable variation in the sources, and it is entirely possible that different writers at different periods were describing a structure that had been modified or damaged and repaired between their visits. The most commonly cited estimate, based on a medieval Arab description, is about 120 metres. That is roughly the height of a modern 40-storey building. In the ancient world, where the tallest ordinary buildings rarely exceeded 5 or 6 stories, and where the only structures approaching this height were the Egyptian pyramids, which were sacred burial monuments, not habitable structures, the Pharos must have been extraordinary to see. Not just large, incomprehensibly large, the kind of object that recalibrates the scale of everything around it. The structure was built in 3 sections, each slightly set back from the one below, so that the overall form was a stepped tower, rising from a broad base to a narrow top. The lower section was square in plan, the middle section octagonal, the top section circular, each transition marking a change in form that made the structure visually interesting as well as structurally sound. The exterior was faced in white limestone or marble, and in the clear Egyptian sun it would have been visible from sea as a brilliant white spike against the flat coastline. The fire at the top burned wood, or possibly naphtha during the night. During the day, the column of smoke from the fire served as a daytime signal. The mirror system is one of the more intriguing technical questions about the pharaohs. Several ancient sources describe a system of mirrors at the top of the lighthouse that amplified and directed the light, making it visible at distances far beyond what a simple fire would achieve. Mirrors in the ancient world meant polished metal, typically bronze. A flat, polished bronze mirror can reflect a fire's light, redirecting it toward the observer. But to achieve the visibility distances claimed for the pharaohs, 50 miles or more, a single flat mirror would not have been sufficient. Some modern researchers have proposed that the pharaohs may have used curved mirrors, which can concentrate and project light over greater distances, or a system of multiple mirrors arranged to achieve a directed beam. The exact mechanism is not known, because the Pharos was taken apart by the earthquakes that destroyed it over several centuries, and by the time anyone thought to investigate the mechanism carefully, it was already underwater. The fire itself required a constant supply of fuel. Wood was the most likely primary fuel, though some ancient sources mention other materials. The logistics of fueling the fire at the top of a 120-metre tower every night for 15 centuries are worth contemplating. Donkeys or oxen carrying loads of fuel up a ramp or staircase inside the tower. Ancient descriptions suggest an internal ramp wide enough for pack animals. Keepers who lived on the island and tended the fire through the night, watching for ships in distress, maintaining the equipment, replacing burned-out wood, adjusting the mirrors. A chain of supply boats bringing fuel from the mainland to the island on a regular schedule. The Pharos was not just a building, it was a small institution, staffed and supplied and maintained with the kind of operational complexity that we associate more readily with modern infrastructure than with the ancient world. The earthquakes came in stages over several centuries, each one taking a little more. The first significant seismic damage occurred in 796 AD, an earthquake that damaged the upper portion of the structure, reducing its height. Further earthquakes in 951 and 956 caused additional damage. A major earthquake in 1303, one of the largest seismic events in the eastern Mediterranean in the medieval period, brought down more of what remained. By 1326, when the Arab traveller Ibn Battuta visited Alexandria, he reported that the structure was already so ruined that it was impossible to enter the building or even to reach the door, which had been blocked by rubble. By the time the Sultan Qaitbay began construction of his fortress on the same site in 1477, the Pharos was gone. Its stones quarried for building material, its 15 centuries of continuous operation reduced to rubble, used in the foundations of a medieval military installation. But the earthquakes did not make the Pharos disappear. They made it fall, and the eastern harbour of Alexandria is not deep. The fallen lighthouse went into between 10 and 30 feet of water, the same shallow harbour that had received the rest of the royal quarter as the seabed subsided over the preceding centuries. The stones of the Pharos, limestone and granite, some of them enormous, some of them still bearing ancient inscriptions, are there on the harbour floor in the area around the fort of Qaitbay. They have been there for 6 or 7 centuries. In 1995, before Goddio's primary survey began, the archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur conducted a survey of the area around Fort Qaitbay and identified over 2,000 ancient blocks lying on the seabed, including pieces of large statues, colossal figures of Ptolemaic rulers, that may have stood at the base of the lighthouse or in its immediate vicinity. Among the finds from that survey were a colossal statue of a Ptolemaic king, approximately 5 metres tall, and a colossal statue of what is believed to be Isis in her Ptolemaic form. Both were recovered from the harbour floor. Both are now displayed in the new Alexandria National Museum. They had been lying in the harbour intact for perhaps 1,000 years. There is something that rewards slow contemplation here. The Pharos was built to be seen. Its entire purpose was visibility, projection, the assertion of presence across distance. It stood at the entrance to the greatest harbour in the ancient world and said to every arriving ship, "Here is Alexandria, here is power, here is the city that the world comes to." For 15 centuries it made that statement, in fire and light and smoke and the brilliant whiteness of its walls against the sky. And then it fell, stone by stone, earthquake by earthquake, into the harbour it had watched over. And now it is down there, in pieces, on the harbour floor, visible to divers with lights, occasionally to snorkelers when the conditions are right. The blocks that held the fire, the base that held the blocks, the monument that was built to be seen from 50 miles away, resting in 12 feet of water, seen now only by those who specifically go looking for it. But the inscription is still in the stones, or something like it. Sostratus of Cnidus, son of Dexiphanes, to the saviour gods, on behalf of those who sail the seas, the stones remember, the water holds them. And in the morning, the light comes down through the surface and illuminates them for a moment, not the steady brilliant fire of the Pharos, but a moving, dancing underwater light. And then it shifts, and the stones go back to the dark, and the harbour goes about its business above them, and the city goes about its business above the harbour, and the ancient world rests in the silt below all of it, patient and complete. The question of what happened to the library's collection, not the building, but the scrolls themselves, is one of the great open questions of ancient intellectual history, and it is worth considering in the context of what we are exploring tonight, because it involves the same kind of loss that the submerged cities represent. Not the loss of stone, which is durable, but the loss of knowledge, which is fragile. Stone can survive 15 centuries on a harbour floor. Papyrus cannot. Text is more vulnerable than architecture in the end. The ancient sources give us several candidates for the destruction of the library. The most famous is Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BC, when Caesar was besieged in Alexandria and burned the ships in the harbour to prevent them from being used against him, and the fire spread to the waterfront and to a warehouse that is sometimes identified as containing scrolls from the library. But scholars who have studied this carefully generally conclude that what burned was a warehouse in the harbour district, not the library itself. The main library in the royal quarter probably survived Caesar's fire. What happened to it afterward is less clear. There was a gradual decline, certainly, a decline that mirrors the gradual decline of Alexandria's intellectual prestige in the first centuries of the Common Era. The Roman emperors who succeeded the Ptolemies were less committed to supporting the museum. The scholars who had come to Alexandria for royal patronage found other centres of learning in the Roman world. The library continued to exist in some form well into the late antique period. There are references to it from the 3rd and 4th centuries AD that suggest it still held significant collections. But by the time of the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD, whatever remained was probably not the great library of the Ptolemies, but a much diminished successor. The fate of the Pharos provides a more concrete history of decline, because its story is physical rather than textual. The lighthouse can be tracked through the archaeological and documentary record in a way that the library's collection cannot, because it was a building and buildings leave traces. The medieval Arab geographers and travellers who visited Alexandria in the centuries after the Arab conquest described the Pharos in progressively more ruinous terms, still standing in the 9th century, reduced in height by the 10th, further damaged by the 11th, apparently barely accessible by the 12th. The earthquakes were doing their work over those centuries, and between earthquakes the structure was weakening, the mortar eroding, the joints opening, the great weight of the upper sections pressing down on stones that were increasingly compromised. What is remarkable is not that it eventually fell, but that it took so long to fall. A structure of 120 metres, built in the 3rd century BC, still standing in recognisable form in the 12th century AD, that is 15 centuries of survival in a seismically active region, in a marine environment without the maintenance that a functioning Ptolemaic kingdom would have provided. The Romans maintained it. The Byzantine authorities maintained it. Even the early Arab authorities apparently saw value in it, as a navigational aid and as a monument. The care that went into maintaining it is itself a testament to the esteem in which it was held, and perhaps to the practical necessity of the light it provided, in a harbour that remained one of the most important in the Mediterranean long after the Ptolemies were gone. We spend a great deal of time in discussions of ancient cities talking about the monuments, the palaces, the temples, the lighthouses, the things that survive, the things that were built to survive, that were built with the explicit intention of outlasting the people who made them, of speaking across centuries to audiences not yet born. This is understandable. They are what the archaeology recovers, what the museum displays, what the textbook illustrates. They were built to be impressive, and they remain impressive. But they were not, in the daily life of Alexandria or Thonis-Heracleion or Pavlopetri, the experience most people had. Most people in ancient Alexandria were not scholars in the museum or courtiers in the palace quarter, or priests in the great Serapeum temple. Most people were dock workers and fishermen and grain merchants and textile sellers and bread bakers and oil pressers and potters and sailors and prostitutes and soldiers and slaves, the whole population of a functioning city, doing the work that functioning cities require, living lives that were ordinary in the sense that most of a life is ordinary, routine, repetitive, shaped by the needs of the body and the rhythms of the day and the seasons. They lived in the parts of Alexandria that were not the royal quarter. They lived in the Jewish quarter, which was enormous. Alexandria had one of the largest Jewish populations of any city in the ancient Mediterranean. Estimates suggest that Jews may have made up a quarter or more of the total population. This community was not marginal or ghettoed in the way that later history would sometimes make Jewish communities in European cities. Alexandrian Jews were prominent in trade, in administration, in the intellectual life of the city. They produced some of the most significant Jewish intellectual work of the period. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, was produced in Alexandria, traditionally attributed to 72 Jewish scholars working in Alexandria at the command of Ptolemy II. Philo of Alexandria, the philosopher who attempted to synthesize Greek philosophy and Jewish theology, was an Alexandrian. The community had its own assembly, its own courts, its own internal governance. They lived in the Egyptian quarter, which occupied the southwestern part of the city, and maintained Egyptian traditions, language, and religious practice, even as the Greek language and Greek culture dominated the upper layers of civic life. The Egyptians of Alexandria were the majority population. Egypt was their country. Alexandria had been built in it. And while the Ptolemaic ruling class was Greek by culture and language, the mass of the people who built the city, who farmed the fields around it, who maintained the temples and performed the rituals were Egyptian. Their gods were ancient. Their traditions were more than 3,000 years old. The Ptolemaic rulers, shrewd enough to understand that ruling Egypt meant ruling the Egyptian religious establishment, worked hard to accommodate and co-opt the Egyptian priesthood, building temples in the Egyptian style, depicting themselves as pharaohs in the ancient iconographic tradition, making offerings in the ancient forms. The population of Alexandria was, by ancient standards, unusually cosmopolitan. A city that sat at the junction of the Greek world, the Egyptian world, and the trade routes of the wider Mediterranean inevitably attracted people from everywhere. There were merchants from Carthage, from Cyprus, from the Levantine coast, from the coasts of Spain and southern France. There were scholars from Athens and from Pergamon, and from every part of the Greek-speaking world, drawn by the library and the museum and the intellectual reputation of the city. There were Jewish communities with their own traditions and their own internal governance. There were Egyptian priests maintaining ancient cults in temples that predated the Ptolemies by 1,000 years. There were Romans increasingly as Roman power in the Mediterranean grew, and Roman merchants followed the trade routes. They did not always get along. Alexandria had some of the worst intercommunal violence in the ancient world. Riots between Jewish and Greek populations, persecution of various groups by various rulers, the kind of tension that builds when many different peoples are pressed together in a small space and competing for resources and status and recognition. The Great Pogrom of 38 AD, when the Greek population of Alexandria launched a violent attack on the Jewish community that resulted in thousands of deaths, is one of the earliest well-documented episodes of anti-Jewish violence in ancient history. The city was alive in the way that cities crowded, with difference are alive. Volatile, creative, dangerous, fascinating, never boring. What did they eat? The ancient sources give us some answers, and the archaeology of the broader region fills in more. Grain was the staple. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, producing wheat and barley in quantities unavailable almost anywhere else in the Mediterranean, and Alexandrians had access to grain in quantities that made bread cheap and available to everyone. Fish was abundant. The harbour teemed with it. The Mediterranean was rich with it, and the inland lake, Lake Mareotis, was famous for its fish to the extent that ancient writers specifically mentioned Mareotic fish in their accounts of the city's resources. Olives and olive oil came in on ships from Crete and the Aegean Islands, dates from the Egyptian interior, figs, pomegranates, chickpeas and lentils in enormous quantities, papyrus shoots, which were apparently eaten as a vegetable by poorer Egyptians, honey, which served as the primary sweetener in a world without refined sugar. The wine is worth noting. Alexandria was, by the accounts of ancient writers, a city that drank seriously and with considerable enthusiasm. The Ptolemaic court had a reputation for elaborate entertainments, for banquets of a scale and expense that struck even Roman visitors as excessive, and Romans of the late Republic were not unfamiliar with excess. Cleopatra's entertainments, as described by ancient sources, were legendary even in her own lifetime. But wine was not just a luxury for the court. It was a staple commodity, consumed at every social level, produced in the Delta region, and imported from across the Mediterranean. The canopic branch of the Nile, near which Thonis-Heracleion stood, was surrounded by vineyards. Lake Mareotis produced wine famous enough to be mentioned by the poet Horace. Alexandria was a city that grew and traded and drank wine, that used wine in its religious ceremonies and its domestic life and its commercial transactions. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always read the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Anyway, back to the mystery. The harbour of Alexandria would have been one of the loudest and most complex places in the ancient world. Ships arriving and departing on the winds and the tides, their crews speaking Greek and Aramaic and Phoenician and Egyptian, and a dozen other languages simultaneously, each conversation a small transaction in the great ongoing business of moving goods around the ancient world. Longshoremen unloading grain amphorae from the hold of a ship arrived from Sicily. The amphorae lowered on ropes to waiting hands on the dock, each one carried to a waiting cart on the shoulder of a man who did this work every day, and whose muscles had been shaped by it. Customs officials checking manifests written on papyrus scrolls, their eyes moving quickly down the lists of declared goods, comparing what the scroll said with what the ship's hold contained. Money changers set up at the harbour entrance, converting currencies from every corner of the Mediterranean: Attic silver from Athens, Macedonian gold from the Ptolemaic mint, Phoenician silver from Tyre, Cypriot bronze, Roman denarii. Each currency had its exchange rate relative to the others, and the exchange rates fluctuated with the news. A war in the eastern Mediterranean would affect the value of Syrian goods. A drought in Sicily would raise the price of wheat, and therefore the value of Egyptian wheat, and therefore the standing of Egyptian merchants in every market from Rome to Rhodes. Pilots who knew the harbour channels guided arriving ships through the approaches, their small boats pulling alongside the larger vessels in the outer harbour, and their captains climbing on board to take the helm for the passage through the shallow water near the Heptastadion. Fishermen in small boats wove between the larger vessels, hauling their nets in the early morning before the harbour traffic made their work impossible. Children ran along the dock edge, watching the ships come in, learning the shapes of different rigs and the flags of different ports, accumulating the maritime knowledge that would define the lives of the boys who would grow up to be sailors. The royal quarter, in the northeastern corner of the harbour front, would have been visible from the docks as a walled enclosure set apart from the working harbour. The buildings rising above the walls, the private harbour of the royal family just inside the entrance, the whole complex projecting into the harbour on its promontory, like a ship permanently moored at the best berth. You could see it, but not enter it, unless you had business there. And inside those walls lived the last of the Ptolemies, and before them, a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. When that world went under the water, first the palaces, then the royal quarter, then the harbour installations, each earthquake taking another piece, what went under was not just stone, it was the physical environment of a specific way of life, a specific way of thinking, a specific way of being in the world. The conversations, the decisions, the meals, the arguments, the silences before sleep, all of it is not recoverable in the way that the stones are recoverable. But the stones remember the shape of the life that surrounded them. The marble floor remembers the weight of the feet that crossed it. The harbour wall remembers the ships that tied against it. And there is something in that. Something that is not nothing. Something that comes close, in its own quiet way, to the idea of memory persisting in matter. The scholars at the museum lived on the grounds of the royal quarter, housed and fed at royal expense in return for their intellectual labour. This was an extraordinary arrangement by the standards of the ancient world, a full-time research institution funded by the state, dedicated not to immediate practical outcomes, but to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The idea that intellectual inquiry had value, that it was worth supporting even when its products were not immediately useful, was not universally accepted in the ancient world. The Ptolemies accepted it. They understood that a city with a reputation as the intellectual capital of the world attracted the best minds, and that the best minds attracted each other, and that this concentration of intellectual firepower was itself a source of prestige and power. The scholars argued, famously and frequently, the ancient sources give us glimpses of the intellectual atmosphere of the museum, competitive, contentious, brilliant. Scholars challenged each other's conclusions, disputed each other's methods, formed schools and anti-schools, wrote polemical treatises against each other's positions. The astronomer Aristarchus proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun, and the Stoic philosopher Cleanthes threatened to prosecute him for impiety. The geographer Eratosthenes proposed a new calculation of the Earth's circumference, and other scholars disputed his methodology. The physician Herophilus performed his dissections in the face of deeply held cultural taboos about the treatment of human bodies and justified them on the grounds that understanding the body was essential to healing it. The library itself, the physical collection, the hundreds of thousands of scrolls that represented the recorded knowledge of the ancient world, was built through a combination of purchase, donation, and what would today be called aggressive acquisition. Ptolemy III, according to ancient sources, borrowed the official Athenian copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, had them copied by the library's scribes, returned the copies to Athens, and kept the originals. He paid the considerable deposit the Athenians required, gladly, and accepted the financial loss. The originals were worth more to the library than the deposit was to the treasury. Ships arriving at Alexandria were searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and the copy returned to the owner while the original was retained. Whether this story is entirely true is disputed. That it was widely believed, and believed to be typical of the Ptolemies' attitude toward the library, tells you something about how seriously they took it. The Serapeum, the great temple complex in the southwestern part of the city, the site of the daughter library, was dedicated to the god Serapis, one of the most interesting divine innovations of the Ptolemaic period. Serapis was a synthetic deity, created by Ptolemy I as a god who could be worshipped by both Greeks and Egyptians, combining aspects of the Egyptian Osiris and Apis bull cult with the visual form of a Greek bearded god associated with healing and the underworld and the abundance of the earth. He was depicted in the Greek style, with a flowing beard and the calm authority of a Zeus or a Poseidon, but carrying Egyptian attributes and carrying an association with death and resurrection that was distinctly Egyptian. He became, over the Ptolemaic period, one of the most widely worshipped gods in the Mediterranean world. His cult spreading across the Greek world and eventually into the Roman world, carried by Alexandrian merchants and sailors to every port they visited. The ordinary people of Alexandria would have encountered the royal quarter not as a place they went into, but as a presence they saw from outside. The buildings rising above the walls, the statues visible at the harbour entrance, the ships of the Royal Navy moored in the private harbour. The palace complex was not a public space in any modern sense. It was the working environment of a royal court, private, guarded, accessible only to those who had business there. But it shaped the character of the city around it in ways that were not private at all. The markets that grew up in its shadow catered to the court's needs. The craftsmen who worked in the city's workshops made things that the court desired. The intellectual culture of the museum filtered outward into the city's educated classes through the relationships and the conversations and the lectures that were, in the ancient world, the medium through which knowledge spread. When the royal quarter went under the water, when the earthquakes came and the silt rose and the sea level climbed and the marble floors found themselves in the dark instead of in the sun, it took with it the physical record of all of this. The library's scrolls had been damaged and dispersed before that, by fire and by the upheavals of the late antique period. The scholars had moved on or died or been scattered by the political changes that eventually ended the Ptolemaic dynasty and the period of Alexandria's intellectual supremacy. But the buildings, the palace walls, the temple platforms, the harbour installations, the floors and the column bases and the masonry of the structures that had housed all of this, those went into the water intact, and the water kept them. The grain trade deserves particular attention because it was the economic engine that made everything else possible. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean, its Nile-irrigated fields producing grain surpluses that were essential to feeding the populations of Greece, Rome, and the other cities of the ancient world. The organisation and management of this grain trade, the logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of tons of grain from the fields of the Nile Valley to the ships in Alexandria's harbour to the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, was one of the most complex administrative achievements of the ancient world, and it was conducted largely through Alexandria. The grain arrived from the interior via the Nile and its canals. Barges brought it downriver from the agricultural regions, through the canal system that connected the river to the harbours, into the storage facilities that lined Alexandria's lake harbour. From the lake harbour it was moved, by labourers, by carts, by the small boats that serviced the harbour infrastructure, to the warehouses of the commercial quarter, and from there it was loaded onto the merchant ships that carried it to its destinations. The city that managed this process was not a city of scholars and philosophers, or not primarily. It was a city of grain handlers and harbour workers, and customs officials and warehousing managers, and the whole supporting infrastructure of a major commercial port. The eastern harbour, the Royal Harbour, the part of the city that is now submerged, was not primarily a commercial harbour. But it was not entirely separate from the commercial life of the city either. The Royal Court was the largest single economic actor in Alexandria, spending enormous sums on construction, on the library, on the army and navy, on the ceremonial and diplomatic events that were a constant feature of royal life. The suppliers of the court, the craftsmen, the food producers, the textile workers, the entertainers, the physicians and the architects and the engineers were part of the economic ecosystem of the city, and their activities were connected to the commercial harbour and to the trade networks that passed through it. There is a building type at Thonis-Heracleion that has no parallel in the other submerged sites, and it is worth noting specifically the naos of the decades. A naos is an inner sanctuary, the most sacred part of an Egyptian temple, the room where the cult image of the god was kept. The naos from Thonis-Heracleion is a black granite box about 2 meters high, inscribed with texts from the Book of the Dead and images of the gods. It is one of the largest and finest naoi known from the period, a magnificent object, clearly the product of royal patronage, placed in the sanctuary of the primary temple of the city. What was inside the naos? The cult image that was kept in such a naos would have been a statue of the god, in this case most likely a moon gerub, made of precious materials dressed in ritual clothing, tended daily by the priests who opened the sanctuary doors each morning and closed them each evening, who fed the god and washed the god and offered the god incense and recited the prayers that maintained the relationship between the divine and the human. The statue itself is not there. It was almost certainly removed before the city went under. Cult statues were not left to the water if the priest had any choice. But the naos that housed it is there, on the harbour floor, in the silt, inscribed with its ancient texts, surrounded by the silence of 30 feet of water. The Mediterranean basin sits above one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. The African plate and the Eurasian plate are moving toward each other at a rate of roughly 2 centimetres per year, a pace so slow as to be unmeasurable in any human lifetime, but over geological time, a force that has built mountain ranges, opened ocean basins, and created the complex fractured landscape of the Mediterranean coasts and islands. Italy, Greece, Turkey, the Levant, the coasts of North Africa. All of this territory is being constantly, imperceptibly deformed by the collision of 2 continental masses that have been moving toward each other for 50 million years. The deformation is not uniform. It is concentrated along fault lines, along the boundaries between smaller crustal blocks within the larger plates, along the zones where one piece of crust dives beneath another. The result for the people who built cities on these coasts was earthquakes. Not occasional earthquakes, not the rare catastrophic events that appear once in a generation or a century, and are remembered as singular disasters. A more or less constant background of seismic activity, small tremors that rattle the cups on the shelves and crack the plaster on the walls, and remind you regularly that the ground you are standing on is not as fixed and permanent as it feels, punctuated by major events that were capable of destroying cities, redirecting rivers, dropping sections of coastline into the sea, and reshaping the Mediterranean landscape in ways visible for centuries afterward. The ancient Mediterranean world was earthquake-prone in a way that its inhabitants could not have fully understood. They had no plate tectonic theory, no seismology, no scientific framework for what was happening beneath their feet. They explained earthquakes as the anger of Poseidon, god of the sea and the earth, the god who held the trident that could split the land and shake the ocean floor. They explained them as the stirring of a giant imprisoned under the earth, Typhon or Enceladus, or one of the other mythological prisoners whose convulsions, in the Greek tradition, caused the land to tremble. They explained them as divine punishment for human pride or impiety, the gods expressing their displeasure in the most unambiguous physical terms available to them. What they knew, experientially and practically, was that the ground sometimes moved, and that when it moved seriously, buildings fell and coastlines changed, and sometimes the sea surged inland with a violence that was not a wave but a wall, and then retreated with an equally violent force, dragging everything the wave had touched back into the ocean, and that there was nothing to be done about it except rebuild and move slightly inland and hope and pray. They developed practical wisdom about earthquake-prone building, keeping structures low, using flexible timber frames rather than rigid stone, avoiding construction on wet or sandy ground near the coast. Some of this wisdom was very good. Some of it was not enough. The process by which coastal cities go under the sea is, in most cases, not the dramatic catastrophe that imagination supplies. It is a combination of processes operating on different timescales, and the result looks different depending on which process dominates at a given location and period. The first process is tectonic subsidence, the slow sinking of the Earth's crust in regions where the geological forces are pulling it down rather than pushing it up. In areas where one tectonic plate is diving beneath another, the overlying crust can be warped downward over broad areas, causing the surface terrain to subside gradually over periods of centuries to millennia. This is not the same as an earthquake. It is not a sudden event, not something that happens on any human timescale, but a geological process so slow that no individual generation would notice it. A city built on a coast that is subsiding at a rate of 1 millimeter per year will, over 1,000 years, be a meter lower than when it was built. Combined with sea level change, the sea has been rising slowly as the ice left from the last glacial maximum has continued to melt. A city that sits 1 meter above sea level at the time of its construction might be 1 meter below sea level 1,000 years later. This is what happened to much of the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean. Careful studies of ancient harbour installations, the cut marks in rock that show where ancient ships' anchor chains wore grooves in the stone over generations of use, the position of ancient tide marks carved into harbour walls, the level of old fish ponds cut into the rock at the water's edge relative to current sea level, reveal that sea levels in the eastern Mediterranean were significantly lower in antiquity than they are today. By how much is contested, and varies by location due to the complex pattern of regional tectonic activity, but estimates generally range from 1 to 3 meters over the last 2 to 3,000 years. That is enough to submerge every coastal installation, every harbour wall, every dock, every fish pond cut into the rock at the water's edge, that was built at sea level in the classical and Hellenistic periods. The second process is liquefaction. The deltic soils of the Nile estuary and the soft alluvial deposits of river mouths and coastal wetlands throughout the Mediterranean are inherently unstable. They are water-saturated. The spaces between the soil particles are filled with water rather than air. They are not compacted by the geological processes that consolidate ancient deep soils into something more like rock. They are in effect a suspension of solid particles in water, held in the appearance of solid ground by the cohesion of the particles and the capillary tension of the water between them. Under the stress of an earthquake, this cohesion can break down. The particles become momentarily suspended in the water. The whole mass flows briefly, like a very thick liquid. Buildings on liquefied soil sink into it, tilt, fracture, or simply disappear as the ground beneath them flows away. Then the earthquake passes, the soil reconsolidates, and what was there before is now buried in a different position, a different orientation, a different depth. This is the primary mechanism for the submergence of Thonis-Heracleion. The city was built on the deltic mud of the Nile, and when the earthquakes came, and they came repeatedly, over several centuries between roughly 200 BC and 700 AD, the mud moved under the buildings and the buildings sank into it, and then the silt settled again over the top of them, and the sea covered everything. It was not instantaneous. It took centuries, probably. Each major earthquake took another piece of the city. Between earthquakes, the city was damaged but functional, or damaged and repaired, or damaged and partially abandoned. But each event left it lower, more vulnerable, more at the mercy of the sea level that was rising around it. The third process is tsunamis. The same seismic activity that produces earthquakes also produces tsunamis. The earthquake displaces the seabed, the displaced seabed displaces the water above it, and the water moves outward in all directions as a wave of enormous energy and very long wavelength. In open water, a tsunami is barely detectable. The wave is long, perhaps 100 kilometers from crest to crest, and shallow, perhaps only a meter high in deep water, and a ship passes over it without knowing it is there. But when it reaches a coast, the wave compresses as the shallow water slows its leading edge. The back of the wave catches up to the front. The wave rises. By the time it reaches the shoreline, it can be 20 or 30 or 50 meters high. Not a breaking wave like a surf wave, but a sustained rise of the sea level, a wall of water that keeps coming and coming, advancing inland at the speed of a running person, unstoppable by anything built by human hands. The ancient Mediterranean experienced several catastrophic tsunamis. The most famous in archaeological terms is the one associated with the eruption of Santorini in the 2nd millennium BC. But the historical period produced its own. A major earthquake off the coast of Crete in 365 AD produced a tsunami that struck Alexandria, the Levantine coast, and the coasts of Greece, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. The contemporary historian Ammianus Marcellinus described it in terms that are recognizable to anyone familiar with modern tsunami accounts. The sea retreating from the shore before the wave arrived, exposing the harbour floor, stranding fish and ships on the mud, drawing crowds of curious onlookers who had never seen this happen before, and then the wave coming back, far higher than the sea had ever been before, and the crowds having no time to run. The 365 AD tsunami killed thousands across the eastern Mediterranean. It damaged ports from Alexandria to Greece to the Levant. In Alexandria specifically, it is believed to have caused significant damage to the harbour infrastructure and to the coastal zone of the city. The royal quarter, already somewhat compromised by decades of gradual subsidence, may have been particularly vulnerable. The tsunami did not sink the royal quarter in one event, but it accelerated the process, damaged what had already been weakened, and left the area more exposed to the continued effects of subsidence and sea level rise that would, over the next several centuries, complete the submergence. The fourth process, relevant not to Alexandria and Thonis-Heracleion, but to sites like Pavlopetri and the dozens of smaller coastal sites around the Mediterranean, is simple abandonment followed by sea level change. When a harbour silts up, or when the trade routes shift and a port loses its commercial reason for existing, or when the population declines for any of the 100 reasons that populations decline in the ancient world, the city empties. And empty cities deteriorate. Without the constant maintenance that keeps buildings standing and harbour walls from crumbling, the physical fabric begins to fail, and the sea, rising by millimetres each decade, eventually claims what the people have left behind. The deep logic of all of this, the reason these cities are still there, still under the water, still yielding things after all this time, is that the same processes that took them under also preserved them. The water that covered them protected them from the oxygen and the biological activity that destroys organic materials on land. The silt that settled over them sealed them from the disturbance that damages archaeological material. The darkness that surrounded them slowed the processes of chemical decay that would, in the light and air of the surface, have turned the marble to powder, and the bronze to green dust and the timber to nothing. The sea takes things, but it takes them carefully. It is, in the end, a better keeper than anything we have built on land. Everything that goes in stays in. Everything that goes in is held there, in the cold and the dark, patient as the geological processes that put it there, waiting with the same geological patience for whatever comes next. There is something worth sitting with in the idea of gradual submergence, the way it differs from the dramatic, sudden catastrophe that the word disaster usually implies. A city that goes under suddenly, buried by an eruption like Pompeii, destroyed by a single earthquake in a matter of minutes, is gone in a way that is comprehensible, even if terrible. There was a before and there was an after, and the transition was swift enough that people who lived through it could tell the story of what happened. But a city that goes under gradually, over generations, over centuries, that is a different kind of loss. There is no single moment of catastrophe to point to. There is only the slow, generational retreat from the water's edge, each generation living slightly further inland than the last, each generation's memory of the old city slightly vaguer, the buildings that used to stand above water gradually finding themselves at water level, then awash at high tide, then always underwater. The people who lived in Thonis-Heracleion in its final centuries knew the city was in trouble. The evidence of subsidence would have been visible, harbour walls that were lower than they used to be, streets that flooded at high tide where they hadn't before, buildings along the waterfront that had to be abandoned as the water claimed their ground floors. The people who lived there would have adapted, as people in slowly sinking cities always adapt, building higher, moving back from the edge, accepting the loss of the lowest and most vulnerable buildings as the price of remaining in a place that still offered, for a time, the commercial advantages that had made the city worth living in. At some point, the commercial advantages ceased to outweigh the physical difficulties. Maybe the harbour became too shallow, the silting up of the canopic branch of the Nile reducing the depth of water available to large ships. Maybe the earthquakes that were gradually lowering the city into the sea also damaged the harbour infrastructure beyond repair. The harbour walls, the quays, the warehouses, the systems for loading and unloading cargo. Maybe the trade simply moved, as trade moves, finding new routes, new ports, new intermediaries, responding to political changes and economic pressures that had nothing to do with the physical condition of Heracleion, but that made other places more attractive to the merchants who'd previously come here. Alexandria, built by the Ptolemies in the same period that Heracleion was declining, was better positioned in almost every respect. It had a deeper harbour, it had a more stable geological foundation, it had the political backing of the ruling dynasty, which was willing to invest in its infrastructure and promote it as the primary gateway to Egypt. The Ptolemies actively redirected trade from Heracleion to Alexandria, not by force, exactly, but by making Alexandria more attractive, more convenient, more richly provided with the services that merchants needed. Gradually, over the Ptolemaic period, Heracleion lost its position as the primary port of Egypt. By the time it went under the water, it was already a secondary city, important for its religious functions, but no longer the commercial powerhouse it had been. The relationship between the geological processes that destroyed Heracleion and the political-economic processes that marginalized it is complex and not entirely clear. Which came first, the physical deterioration or the commercial decline? Did the city begin to sink because it had lost its investment and its maintenance, or did it lose its investment and its maintenance because it was beginning to sink? These are questions that the archaeology cannot fully answer, because the archaeological record does not preserve the decisions and the calculations of the merchants and the officials who made the choices that determined the city's fate. What the record preserves is the result: a city that was once one of the most important commercial centres in the ancient world, now on the floor of Abu Qir Bay, its harbour full of anchor stocks and its temple courts full of cult objects, and its streets full of the pottery of 6 centuries of trade. The question of how you excavate an ancient city under 30 feet of water in a busy modern harbour, without destroying what you are trying to recover, without disturbing what you are not yet ready to recover, without losing track of where things are or misattributing context, or making the 1,000 other mistakes that compromise archaeological evidence. This is not a simple question. It is a question that occupied archaeologists for most of the 20th century, without being fully resolved, and that is still being refined by the people doing the work. Before the invention of scuba, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus developed in the 1940s primarily by Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon, underwater archaeology was barely archaeology at all. Divers could go down with surface-supplied air and retrieve objects, but they could not stay down long enough, move freely enough, or work carefully enough to do the painstaking documentation and controlled excavation that archaeology requires. What they produced was collections of objects stripped of their context, objects known to have come from somewhere underwater, in the general vicinity of somewhere interesting, but without the spatial relationships to each other and to their surrounding material that give objects their meaning. Context is everything in archaeology. An amphora sitting in a museum case is interesting, beautiful perhaps, if it is well made, and suggestive of the ancient world's material culture. But an amphora found in a specific spot on the floor of a harbour, surrounded by other amphorae of specific types, near the remains of a specific warehouse, at a depth consistent with a specific period of the city's history. That amphora is a piece of evidence. It tells you what was stored there, tells you where it came from, because the clay of an amphora contains minerals specific to the region where it was made, and scientific analysis can identify those minerals. It tells you when it was stored there, because the style of the amphora's handle or its shape can often be dated to within a few decades. It tells you something about the trade network that brought it to this place, because you can map where amphorae of this type appear across the Mediterranean and begin to trace the routes they followed. Strip the amphora from its context and you have a beautiful object and a mystery. Leave it in context and you have the beginning of an answer to a question about how the ancient world worked. The development of scuba gave underwater archaeologists the time and freedom to work carefully, to lie on the seabed for an hour documenting the position of objects before moving any of them, to measure distances and record angles, to take photographs that would allow the excavated area to be reconstructed on paper afterward. The development of underwater photography and video gave them the ability to create records of what they found that could be reviewed and analysed on the surface, outside the constraints of limited air supply and cold water, and the development of digital mapping tools, particularly in the last 20 years, as computing power and digital imaging have made possible things that were not conceivable before, has given underwater archaeologists the ability to create extraordinarily precise, three-dimensional records of entire site areas. Goddio's team working in Alexandria uses multi-beam sonar, a system that fires multiple sonar beams simultaneously, each angled slightly differently from the others, and combines the returns from all of them to create a detailed three-dimensional model of the seabed surface. This is not the simple one-beam sonar that gives a rough outline of the bottom. It is a system capable of resolving features at the scale of tens of centimetres, showing individual large objects lying on the seabed, indicating the presence of structural remains buried under sediment, and tracking changes in the seabed topography across the entire survey area. The resulting maps are not photographs. They are more like very detailed topographic maps in grayscale, showing the shape of every feature of the bottom with the kind of precision that allows a trained eye to distinguish between a natural geological feature and an archaeological structure. Sub-bottom profilers do something complementary. Rather than bouncing sound waves off the seabed surface, they penetrate it. The sound energy passes through soft sediment and reflects off harder materials buried below, including archaeological structures. The profiler cannot tell you what the buried structure is made of, but it can tell you its depth, its extent, and something about its nature from the character of the reflection. A dense stone wall reflects differently from a compacted earthen floor, which reflects differently from the unconsolidated silt that surrounds them. With experience and careful calibration, the sub-bottom profiler becomes a tool for seeing through the seabed. Not clearly, not in detail, but enough to identify where the divers should go and what they are likely to find when they get there. When the divers go down, they work within a three-dimensional coordinate system that has been established using acoustic positioning technology, the underwater equivalent of GPS, which cannot function in water because radio waves do not travel through it. Acoustic transponders are placed at known positions around the site, and the diver's equipment communicates with them to establish position with an accuracy of a few centimetres. Every object found, every structural element documented, every sample taken is assigned coordinates that place it precisely within the overall map of the site, so that its exact position relative to everything else known about the site is recorded and can be queried afterward. The actual work of documentation on the seabed involves lying face down over an object or a section of archaeological material, moving slowly and carefully and recording what you see. In the turbid water of the eastern harbour of Alexandria, this is difficult. The visibility can be very poor, less than a metre in bad conditions, and the work of documentation requires seeing clearly what you're documenting. Divers carry lights. The lights illuminate a small area around each diver, creating a bubble of visibility in the murk. But the quality of the light is not the same as sunlight, and the shadows are different, and the eye, deprived of the normal cues of colour and distance and shadow that it uses to interpret what it is seeing, makes different errors underwater than it makes on land. Working in this environment for years, learning to read the seabed in its own terms rather than in terms of what the surface world looks like is a skill that takes a long time to develop. The photography is done underwater with specialised housings that protect the camera equipment from the pressure and the water. For three-dimensional photogrammetry, the technique of constructing accurate three-dimensional models from overlapping photographs, a diver may take hundreds or even thousands of photographs of a single feature, moving around it in a systematic pattern, ensuring that every surface is captured from multiple angles. The photographs are then processed by software on the surface that identifies matching points across multiple images and calculates the precise three-dimensional position of each point, building up a model that can be viewed and measured and analysed in detail. The removal of objects from the site when it happens is done with the same care as terrestrial excavation. Objects are photographed and measured in their original position before being touched. The sediment surrounding them is sampled for pollen, seeds, and other organic material that might contribute to the interpretation of the object's context. The layer of sediment in which the object is found is identified and recorded because the stratigraphic sequence of the seabed, the order in which the various layers of sediment were deposited, is as important to interpreting the finds as the stratigraphy of a land site. An object found in a layer that can be dated to the 1st century BC is telling you something different from the same type of object found in a layer dated to the 4th century AD. There is one aspect of working in the eastern harbour of Alexandria that has no real counterpart in land excavation. The harbour is a working harbour. Modern ships pass through it on a daily basis. Their propellers create wash that disturbs the near-surface sediment. Their anchors are sometimes dropped in areas that overlap with the archaeological survey zone. The team has to schedule their dives around harbour traffic, work within the constraints of a port authority that has its own requirements for safety and access, and deal with visibility conditions that vary enormously depending on the season, the weather, and how much recent boat traffic has stirred up the fine silt of the harbour floor. The visibility challenge is compounded by the fact that the harbour floor is not a stable environment. Fine silt is constantly being moved by currents and by turbulence from boat traffic. An area that was clearly visible on one dive may be covered in a thin layer of new silt on the next dive a week later, requiring the diver to brush the surface clear before any documentation can begin. And the process of brushing, even done with the gentlest hands, with the finest brushes, stirs up the silt and temporarily reduces the visibility to near zero in the immediate area, requiring the diver to wait for the silt to settle before the work can continue. What the technology cannot do, and what no technology can do, is replace the interpretive judgment of the archaeologist working with the evidence. The sonar maps tell you where the structures are. The photographs tell you what they look like. The laboratory analysis of recovered objects tells you what they are made of and when they were made. But the question of what all of this means, what building this was, what it was used for, who used it, when it went under and why, requires the kind of sustained, careful interpretation that brings together physical evidence, textual sources, comparative material from other sites, and the accumulated judgment of a discipline that has been thinking about these questions for many decades. The ancient texts are crucial tools in this interpretation. Strabo's description of Alexandria, written in the 1st century BC when the city was at or near its peak, is one of the primary sources. He describes the royal quarter, the location of specific buildings, the layout of the harbour, the position of the heptastadion, the character of different parts of the city. These descriptions are not architectural drawings. They do not provide measurements or precise spatial information in the way that a modern site plan would. But they are specific enough, in their description of what was where and what it looked like and how it related to other things, to allow identification when the physical remains can be correlated with the text. This correlation, the moment when the sonar image and the ancient text click together, when the description of a building and the pattern of stones on the harbour floor become recognisably the same thing, is, by the accounts of those who have experienced it, one of the most extraordinary feelings in archaeological work. It is the moment when the past becomes present, when the description written 2,000 years ago is confirmed by physical evidence that has been lying undisturbed for 1,500 years. The city that was described, the city that went under, the city that is still there, all the same city, all speaking at once, in different voices, all saying the same thing. The conservation of objects recovered from the harbour floor is a process that requires as much care as the excavation itself, and that often takes much longer. An object that has spent 15 centuries in seawater is in a chemical equilibrium with that environment. The salts in the seawater have penetrated the fabric of the object, and if the object is simply removed from the water and allowed to dry, the salts will crystallize as the water evaporates, and the crystallization pressure will shatter the object from within. A piece of ancient pottery that has survived 15 centuries in the harbour can be destroyed in a matter of hours by careless handling after recovery. The conservation process for objects recovered from marine environments involves a careful, gradual removal of the salts from the material, a process that takes months or years, depending on the material and the degree of salt saturation. Wood is particularly challenging, because it has been kept structurally intact only by the water that saturates its cells, and if it dries without treatment, the cells collapse and the wood crumbles. The boats from Thonis-Heracleion, the 69 ancient vessels, some of which still have their structural timbers, require elaborate conservation treatment that may take years per vessel. The wood is kept in fresh water while the salts leach out, then gradually treated with consolidants that reinforce the cell walls before the water is slowly, carefully removed. The conservators who work on material from underwater sites are a different speciality from the archaeologists, and a different speciality from the museum curators, who will eventually display what is recovered. They occupy the middle ground between the site and the museum, the people who make it possible for what the divers recover to survive long enough to be studied. Their work is invisible in the way that most technical work is invisible. You see the Sphinx in the museum case, beautifully lit, and you do not think about the years of careful work that made it safe to display. But the work was done by people with chemistry degrees and years of experience with ancient materials and an enormous amount of patience. There is a specific challenge in working on the material from Thonis-Heracleion that is worth noting: the organic material. The harbour floor in Abu Qir Bay is extraordinarily rich in organic material. The seeds, the plant remains, the wood of the boats, the rope fibres, the animal bones. This is a consequence of the conditions of the site: the cold, the lack of oxygen, the fine silt that sealed everything in place. But the richness of the organic material creates a conservation challenge, because each type of material requires different treatment, and the objects on the site are often composed of multiple materials that may require incompatible treatments. A lead anchor stock is relatively easy to conserve. Lead is stable in seawater, and the main challenge is removing the marine concretion that has built up on its surface and revealing the inscription underneath. A wooden boat hull is much more difficult. A rope made of organic fibres, lying in contact with a lead anchor stock and a piece of pottery and the bones of a fish, presents a complex conservation challenge that requires treating each material appropriately without damaging the others. The people who work on this material are solving engineering problems as much as preservation problems, and the solutions they develop often have applications beyond the specific site. The documentation work continues after the conservation work, because the objects, once treated and stabilized, can be subjected to analytical techniques that were not possible in the field. Chemical analysis of the clay in pottery sherds can identify the precise source of the clay, sometimes with enough precision to identify the specific workshop where the vessel was made. Isotope analysis of lead objects can identify the ore source of the lead, allowing the trading history of the metal to be traced across the Mediterranean. DNA analysis of plant and animal remains can identify species with a precision that visual identification cannot always achieve. Each of these analytical techniques adds a layer of information to the object, and each layer adds to the picture of the ancient world that the objects collectively are building. The collaboration between archaeologists and historians that underwater work demands is worth noting as a particular feature of the field. Land archaeology can, in principle, be conducted without extensive reference to the textual record. The material evidence can speak for itself, particularly in periods where no textual record exists. But underwater archaeology of ancient harbours and port cities is almost always conducted in dialogue with texts, because the ancient world left a textual record of its maritime activities that is unusually rich. Trade routes, harbour facilities, shipping methods, the names of merchants, the costs of goods, the regulations governing harbour use. All of this is present to varying degrees in the surviving ancient literature and documentation. The challenge is that the textual record and the material record do not always align. A text may describe a harbour that the archaeological survey cannot find. A survey may reveal structures that no text mentions. A text may name a building or a monument that cannot be identified among the structures the divers have mapped. These misalignments are not failures of either method, they are opportunities. They reveal the gaps in both records, the places where the written tradition preserved some things, and the material tradition preserved others, and where the comparison of the two is more informative than either one alone. The photogrammetric models that the Alexandria team has produced, three-dimensional digital reconstructions of the harbour floor built from thousands of overlapping photographs, have a quality that is worth describing, because it is not immediately obvious how useful they are until you understand what they enable. A photogrammetric model is not a photograph. It is a spatial model, a mathematical description of the three-dimensional surface of whatever was photographed, built by comparing the positions of the same features across hundreds of overlapping images taken from slightly different positions. The model can be rotated, sliced, measured, compared with earlier or later models of the same surface. Distances can be measured, volumes can be estimated. Changes over time, the shift of a stone, the accumulation of new silt, the collapse of an unstable wall, can be tracked. This tracking function is, ultimately, the most important thing the technology enables for the long-term management of the site. A photogrammetric survey from 2005 and a photogrammetric survey from 2025 of the same area of the harbour floor can be directly compared, pixel by pixel in 3 dimensions, to reveal exactly what has changed. Where has the silt moved? Which stones have shifted? What new material has appeared and what has disappeared? The comparison is not possible with traditional survey methods, because traditional surveys cannot record 3-dimensional surface information with the precision and completeness that photogrammetry provides. The technology does not just help excavate the site, it helps monitor it, a function that will become increasingly important as the pace of investigation and the rate of natural change both accelerate. Alexandria and Thonis-Heracleion and Pavlopetri are the most thoroughly studied of the Mediterranean's drowned cities. But they are not alone, and they are not unusual. They are instead the most visible examples of a phenomenon that stretches along every ancient coastline in the world, the slow, ongoing work of the sea reclaiming what was built on its edge. The Italian coast alone has yielded dozens of significant submerged sites. The ancient Roman harbour of Baia, in the Bay of Naples near Pozzuoli, is the largest and most famous, a complex of Roman villas, temples, baths, and harbour installations that went under as the volcanic ground of the Phlegraean Fields subsided in the medieval period. The name Phlegraean Fields, from the Greek for burning, refers to the volcanic nature of the terrain. The whole area is underlain by a massive volcanic system, and the ground rises and falls over decades and centuries as magma moves in the chambers beneath it. In the process, geologists call bradycism. Baia was, in its heyday, the most fashionable resort in the Roman world. Julius Caesar had a villa there. Cicero had a villa there, and wrote from it letters that survive and that describe the view of the bay and the quality of the local fish and the pleasures of being away from Rome in the summer heat. Mark Antony had a villa there. The emperors built along its shores: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero. It was where the Roman aristocracy went in the summer to escape the heat and noise and political tension of the city, to bathe in the warm volcanic springs that gave the bay its distinctive character, to eat oysters from the famous Lucrinian beds just north of the town, to conduct the kind of informal political business that could not be done in the formality of the Senate. It began to subside in the early medieval period as the volcanic ground beneath it gradually moved. The villas went under slowly, over centuries, the way everything in Baia went under, gradually, with enough time for people to move their most valuable possessions to higher ground, and enough time for the buildings themselves to settle into the water in something like their original condition. By the end of the medieval period, the central part of ancient Baia was 15 or 20 feet underwater. It is still there. You can visit it today as a snorkeler or a diver. The mosaics are on the floors, not on museum walls, but on the floors of the rooms they were originally laid in, visible through the clear Mediterranean water that covers them in spring and summer. The columns are standing up to their capitals, rising from the seabed in the rooms they were built to support. The statues, or replicas of the original statues, most of which were removed to a nearby museum for preservation, stand in their original positions in the rooms designed to display them. It is an underwater museum in the most literal sense, an ancient domestic environment, submerged and preserved and accessible, showing you what a wealthy Roman seaside villa actually looked like from the inside, in a way that no museum reconstruction could replicate. Along the coast of Turkey, the ancient Lycian and Carian coasts that face the eastern Aegean, there are dozens of sites where ancient buildings, rock-cut tombs, and harbour installations are now partially or fully submerged. The Lycians were a distinctive ancient people, related to neither the Greeks nor the Persians, though eventually absorbed by both, who built cities along the rocky southwestern coast of Turkey for more than 1,000 years before the Roman period. Their tombs are among the most recognisable things they left. Large rock-cut chambers in the cliff faces above their cities, sometimes carved in the form of house facades with wooden beams and door frames rendered in stone, sometimes simple chambers with elaborate inscriptions. Many of these tombs are now partially underwater, the lower sections submerged by the same combination of sea level rise and tectonic subsidence that has affected the whole eastern Mediterranean coast. The sunken city near Cocova Island, known informally as Dolciste or sometimes just as the Sunken City, is one of the most photographed underwater sites in the Mediterranean. The water around Cocova is remarkably clear. The island is remote. There is no significant boat traffic. The bottom is sandy and undisturbed. Ancient walls, staircases, harbour installations and building foundations are visible from the surface in water so clear that snorkelers can see them from above without diving down. Tourists circle the site on kayaks and glass-bottom boats, looking through the water at a city that has been there, in various stages of submergence, for perhaps 1,500 years. The Greek island of Epidaurus has a submerged ancient harbour visible from the surface in several places. The island of Delos, the sacred island, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis in Greek mythology, the most important religious site in the Aegean for much of the first millennium BC, the site of the pan-Hellenic sanctuary that drew pilgrims and merchants from across the Greek world, has submerged structures along its western and northern shores, the remains of the ancient harbour district that served the island in its centuries of greatest importance. Delos was, at the height of its prosperity in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, one of the most important trading posts in the eastern Mediterranean, a free port where merchants from every corner of the ancient world gathered to buy and sell slaves, grain, textiles, metals, and all the other goods that moved through the Mediterranean trade network. Its harbour was crowded, its streets were busy, its population was cosmopolitan in the way that only major commercial hubs are cosmopolitan, and now its harbour is partly underwater, and the streets of its business district are accessible only to divers. In the eastern Mediterranean, the ancient Phoenician cities of the Lebanese and Israeli coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Caesarea Maritima, all have submerged harbour installations and underwater archaeological remains from the period when they were among the most important commercial centres in the ancient world. Tyre's ancient harbour, from which Phoenician ships carried the famous purple dye that was worth more than its weight in gold, literally sometimes, and cedar timber and fine glass and silversmith's work across the Mediterranean for nearly 1,000 years, is now largely underwater. The great offshore island on which Tyre was originally built has been connected to the mainland by sedimentation since Alexander the Great built a causeway to besiege it in 332 BC, but the harbour installations that served the Phoenician merchants are on the seabed, in the waters around the modern city. The harbour at Caesarea Maritima, the Roman port city built by Herod the Great on the Israeli coast beginning around 22 BC, is one of the most extensively studied underwater harbour sites in the world. Herod's engineers built the harbour using Roman hydraulic concrete, a mixture of lime, volcanic ash and seawater that actually gains strength when immersed in seawater, hardening through a chemical reaction with the seawater rather than being weakened by it. The resulting harbour moles, the massive walls that enclosed the harbour basin and protected it from the Mediterranean waves, were built to a size that ancient accounts describe as unprecedented, and they were built to last. 2,000 years later, they are still largely intact on the seabed, in 10 to 20 feet of water, mapped and studied by generations of underwater archaeologists. Beyond the Mediterranean, the question of what lies on the continental shelves of the world's oceans is one of the largest open questions in archaeology. 12,000 years ago, the sea level was approximately 120 metres lower than it is today, a consequence of the enormous volume of water locked up in the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum. As those ice sheets melted, over a period of several thousand years, the sea rose. Not suddenly, not dramatically in any single human generation, but inexorably and over the long term by 120 metres, the difference between the shoreline of 12,000 years ago and the shoreline of today. The 120-metre difference means that every continental shelf in the world, the shallow undersea plateau that extends from the coastline to the edge of the deep ocean floor, was, 12,000 years ago, dry land. The North Sea, which is today an average of only 95 metres deep, was entirely dry land, traversed by rivers, inhabited by animals including mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, fished and hunted by the people who lived on its plains. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was connected to the European continent by a broad plain through which the Thames and the Rhine flowed as tributaries of a single larger river system. The Persian Gulf was dry land, with a major river flowing through it. The Bass Strait between mainland Australia and Tasmania was dry land. If people lived along coastlines 12,000 years ago, and they did, everywhere in the world, because coastlines offered resources that inland environments could not match, the protein richness of the sea, the flatness of river mouths, the diversity of ecosystems at the land-sea boundary, then those people's coastal settlements are now on the continental shelves, under the sea, preserved potentially in the same cold, dark, anaerobic conditions that have preserved the royal quarter of Alexandria and the streets of Thonis-Heracleion. We have found almost none of them. We have not looked. The systematic survey of the continental shelves for archaeological evidence has barely begun, and the one or two surveys that have been done have produced results tantalizing enough to suggest that the effort would be rewarded, if it were made. The Mediterranean coast is long. The sea has been rising for millennia. What the water has taken, it has taken carefully. And somewhere in the cold and the dark of the shallows, the oldest human coastlines in the world are waiting, with their characteristic patience to be found. The harbour at Caesarea Maritima deserves more than a passing mention, because it is one of the most thoroughly documented ancient underwater sites in the world, and one of the most instructive about the relationship between ancient engineering ambition and the long-term behaviour of the sea. Herod the Great built this harbour beginning around 22 BC, in a place where there was no natural harbour at all, a completely open stretch of coast, exposed to the prevailing Mediterranean wind, with no sheltering headland or island. He built the harbour from scratch, using Roman hydraulic concrete to construct harbour moles, the massive arms that enclosed the harbour basin, on a scale that contemporary accounts describe as unprecedented. The concrete was a marvel of ancient engineering. Ordinary concrete cannot be used underwater, the water prevents it from curing, but Roman hydraulic concrete, made with volcanic ash called pozzolana from the volcanic region near Rome, undergoes a chemical reaction with seawater that actually strengthens it over time. The calcium silicate hydrates that form in the reaction create a more durable material than ordinary air-cured concrete, and the resulting structure is more resistant to the chemical action of seawater than modern Portland cement concrete. Herod's engineers imported the pozzolana from Italy, a substantial logistical undertaking for a harbour on the Israeli coast, and used it to build harbour moles that have now been standing partly underwater for 2,000 years. The harbour silted up and was abandoned in the medieval period, but the moles are still there, on the seabed, in 10 to 20 feet of water, their concrete intact, their scale impressive even in their ruined state. Underwater surveys in the 20th century measured the harbour's dimensions and found that it was indeed enormous, one of the largest artificial harbours built anywhere in the ancient world, larger than the harbour of the Piraeus at Athens, comparable in scale to the great harbours of Alexandria. Herod, who was in many respects a client of Rome and a builder of Roman-style infrastructure, built a harbour that reflected Roman ambitions rather than the modest scale of the surrounding region. He wanted Caesarea to be a gateway to the Roman world from the Levantine coast, and he built it to those specifications. Across the Adriatic from Italy, the Dalmatian coast of modern Croatia is studded with islands and inlets, and the ancient Greeks established a series of colonies here in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, taking advantage of the sheltered harbours and the access to the Adriatic trade routes. Several of these colonies have submerged remains. The rising Adriatic sea level and the tectonic settling of the eastern Adriatic coast have submerged harbour installations, and in some cases entire coastal districts. The island of Vis, known in antiquity as Issa, was the site of a Syracusan colony and later a significant Hellenistic city. Its harbour district has underwater remains that include ancient breakwaters and harbour walls, visible in the clear Adriatic water. The French Mediterranean coast, the Côte d'Azur and the Languedoc coast, has its own underwater sites, reflecting the ancient Greek colonisation of this coast, beginning in the 7th century BC. The Greeks established their first colony on the western Mediterranean coast at Massalia, modern Marseille, around 600 BC. Massalia grew into one of the most important trading cities on the western Mediterranean coast, and it maintained close relationships with the native Ligurian and Celtic populations of the hinterland. The ancient harbour of Massalia has been partly identified under the modern harbour. Archaeologists working in advance of harbour construction projects have found ancient harbour walls, amphorae, and the remains of ships that were unloading their cargo at Massalia's dock 2,500 years ago. The sheer geographic spread of these sites, from the eastern Mediterranean to the western, from the North African coast to the Dalmatian islands, makes a point that is worth making explicitly. The ancient Mediterranean was a single interconnected system. A drought in Egypt raised grain prices in Athens. A political upheaval in the Levant disrupted the supply of Lebanese cedar that Greek shipbuilders needed. A technological innovation in glassmaking at Sidon spread within decades to craftsmen in Rome and Alexandria and Carthage. The sea was not a barrier in this world, it was a highway, and every coastal city was connected to every other coastal city by the ships that moved constantly across it. When those cities went under the water, whether suddenly or gradually, whether through earthquake or subsidence or tsunami, or the slow, inexorable rise of the sea, they took with them pieces of that interconnected system. The pottery types, the coin distributions, the anchor stocks with their merchants' names, the hull planking of the ships, all of these are not just local evidence, they are nodes in a network, and finding them and documenting them is a way of recovering the network itself, of understanding how the ancient Mediterranean system worked, what it looked like from the inside, how it managed the movement of goods and information and people across thousands of miles of open water. The Turkish coast, ancient Lycia and Ionia, has an unusual density of submerged remains because of a geological phenomenon specific to this coastline. The slow tectonic subsidence of the western Anatolian continental margin. The Anatolian plate is moving and rotating relative to the Aegean plate, and the western edge of Anatolia is gradually sinking as it does. Cities that were at sea level 2,000 years ago are now partly underwater, not because the sea rose but because the land fell. The effect is similar to what happened at Thonis-Heracleion and in Alexandria's eastern harbour, but the cause is a different part of the same tectonic system. Kakova Roads, near the ancient city of Apelé on the Lycian coast, is the most visually dramatic of these sites. A stretch of shallow water in which the ruins of the ancient city's lower districts are clearly visible from the surface in remarkably transparent water. The stone walls and house platforms and harbour installations spread across the seabed in a configuration that is instantly recognisable as urban. Boat tours visit the site. Snorkelers swim over the walls. The ancient streets are navigable in the way that streets usually are, except that the medium is water rather than air. It is one of the few submerged sites in the world where the general visitor, not a diver, not an archaeologist, can directly experience the sensation of moving through a drowned city. There is a sphinx in the Alexandria National Museum that came out of the harbour in the 1990s. It is black granite, roughly a metre long, and its face has been worn by the water and the sand and the 15 centuries it spent on the harbour floor into something softer and more indistinct than it was when it was new. The features are still readable, the broad face, the headdress, the slight upward curve at the corners of the mouth that is not quite a smile but is something in that direction. The expression that Egyptian artists developed over 3,000 years of trying to capture divinity in stone and eventually settled on as something like serene alertness. The serenity looks different now than it did when the stone was fresh. The water has given it something the carver did not put there, the particular quality of something that has been very still for a very long time. It is beautiful, but what makes it interesting, what makes it significant rather than simply beautiful, is where it was and what surrounded it. It was found in the northeastern corner of the harbour, in the area that the ancient texts describe as the royal quarter. It was found near other pieces of Ptolemaic statuary. It was found near architectural remains whose dimensions match descriptions of specific buildings in the ancient sources. The Sphinx itself, lying in the silt, was already telling you something about where it was and what it had been part of. The object and its context together are an argument. The object alone is a question. The objects recovered from these sites are extraordinary individually. Collectively, they are something more. They are a grammar, a set of structured elements that can be read as a kind of language if you know the vocabulary and the syntax. Each object is a word, and the arrangement of objects, their positions relative to each other, the layers they are found in, the types of objects they are found alongside, is the syntax that gives the words their meaning in relationship. Read correctly. The grammar tells you the history of a place in a detail and a specificity that no written text can match, because texts are written about what writers consider worth writing about, while objects are the full residue of everything that happened, including the things no one thought to record. Consider the anchor stocks from Thonis-Heracleion. An anchor stock is the heavy crosspiece at the top of an ancient anchor, lead or stone, sometimes inscribed with the name of the ship or the owner, designed to stabilize the anchor as it falls through the water and ensure it lands in a position where the iron flukes at the bottom can grip the seabed. They are heavy, they are simple, and they are virtually indestructible. The floor of the harbour at Thonis-Heracleion is covered with them. Hundreds of anchor stocks, each one representing a ship that moored in this harbour at some point between the 7th century BC and the 1st century AD and dropped anchor and never recovered it. Why would you not recover your anchor? Anchors were expensive in the ancient world. Lead was not cheap and stone had to be quarried and shaped and transported to the harbour. A merchant would recover his anchor if he could. You lose it when something prevents recovery, when you have to cut loose quickly because of a sudden storm or an unexpected threat, or when the anchor becomes fouled in something on the bottom, a submerged structure, a dense patch of weed, another lost anchor, and the effort of freeing it is not worth the cost. The density of anchor stocks on the floor of Thonis-Heracleion tells you, in the aggregate, about the scale and character of the harbour's use. A harbour with hundreds of lost anchors on its floor was a busy harbour, one that saw enough ships in enough difficult conditions that losses were frequent. Some of the anchor stocks from Thonis-Heracleion are inscribed. The inscriptions are in Greek, the commercial language of the Eastern Mediterranean in the period of the city's greatest activity, and they record the names of ships or the names of the merchants who owned them. One reads, in Greek, a name and a brief dedication. Another records the name of a ship and the port of its registry. These inscriptions are not literature. They are not even particularly interesting writing. They are the kind of functional text that people produce when they want to identify their property, the ancient equivalent of writing your name in your books. But they are extraordinary in another sense. They are the names of people who came to this harbour 2,500 years ago. They stood on a dock that is now 20 feet underwater. Their ships were tied to harbour walls that are now on the seabed. And their names are still there, in the lead of the anchor stocks, in the silt of the harbour floor waiting to be read. The coins from the same site tell a different kind of story. Thousands of coins have been recovered from Thonis-Heracleion. Bronze coins, silver coins, a small number of gold coins, from every period of the city's occupation, and from an extraordinary range of origins. Coins from Greece proper, Attic silver tetradrachms, the famous owl coins of Athens, stamped with the goddess Athena on one side and her owl on the other, that served as the international currency of the classical world, the dollar of the ancient Mediterranean, accepted in markets from Spain to India. Coins from Corinth, with the winged horse Pegasus. Coins from Rhodes, with the head of the sun god Helios. Coins from the Ptolemaic kingdom, stamped with the portraits of successive rulers, each one slightly more realistic, or slightly more stylized depending on the ruler's preference, than the last. Each coin represents a transaction. Someone paid for something here, or received payment for something here, and the coin was lost, dropped in the market, slipped through fingers on the dock, fallen from a pocket on the gangplank of a ship. The distribution of coin types across the harbour area is not random. Certain types cluster in certain locations, and those clusters tell you something about which part of the harbour handled which kinds of trade. Attic silver coins clustered in one area suggest a zone where merchants from the Greek world conducted their business. Ptolemaic coins in another area suggest the location of the official customs post or the royal treasury. The coins are a map of economic activity, drawn in the only material that economic activity leaves behind. The pottery tells a still different story. Pottery in the ancient world was the packaging of international trade, not itself traded, except occasionally, for very fine wares whose beauty justified the cost of transport, but the container in which traded goods were moved. Olive oil travelled in amphorae, wine travelled in amphorae, fish sauce, one of the most important condiments in the ancient world, used in virtually every Roman and Greek kitchen, the way soy sauce is used in Asian cooking today, produced from fermented fish and water in the same kind of tidal flat fish works that Heracleion was ideally positioned to maintain, travelled in amphorae. Grain travelled in large storage vessels. Resins, pigments, honey, dried fruit. All of these moved across the Mediterranean in pottery containers. The type of pottery, the clay it was made from, the form of the vessel, the shape of the handle and the rim, the treatment of the surface, can tell you where it was made, because the clay of different regions contains distinctive mineral signatures that survive the firing and the centuries in the sediment. The amphora type from the island of Chios looks different from the amphora type from the island of Lesbos, looks different from the amphora type from Corinth, looks different from the amphora type made in the delta of the Nile. Sorting the pottery from a harbour site by origin and by date is a way of mapping the trade network that served the harbour, of identifying which regions were trading partners and when, of watching the network shift over time as political and economic conditions changed. The pottery from Thonis-Heracleion spans 6 centuries and covers the eastern Mediterranean. Attic fine wares from Greece, the black figure and red figure pottery that was one of the luxury exports of classical Athens, its distinctive shapes and painted scenes instantly recognisable to archaeologists. Cypriot transport amphorae, the standard container for Cypriot goods moving westward into the Mediterranean. Phoenician storage jars, their distinctive elongated form produced by Phoenician potters in cities along the Lebanese coast. Egyptian wares in Egyptian forms made from the distinctive alluvial clay of the Nile Delta. All of them together, lying in the silt of a harbour floor in Abu Qir Bay, map the trade network of the eastern Mediterranean in the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE with a clarity that no text could provide. One of the more unexpected categories of object from these sites is organic material. The anaerobic conditions of the harbour floor, no oxygen, no biological activity capable of breaking down organic compounds, cold water that slows all chemical reactions, preserve organic materials that would not survive for a month on land. Wood survives. The boats recovered from Thonis-Heracleion still have their hull planking and structural timbers, 47 vessels in varying states of preservation, their wood darkened and fragile but still holding its shape, still showing the marks of the tools used to shape it 25 centuries ago. Seeds survive, charred or waterlogged, but identifiable. Plant remains survive. Animal bones survive, including fish bones in enormous quantities. The accumulated evidence of centuries of people eating fish in this harbour. There is rope. Actual ancient rope, preserved in the silt. Not the shadow of rope, not the impression of rope, but the physical fibres of it, the twist of the strands, the splice of an end that someone made with their hands 2,500 years ago. Rope is one of the most important and least preserved technologies of the ancient world. We know it existed. We know ships needed enormous quantities of it. We know it was made from many different plant fibres depending on what was locally available. But actual examples of ancient rope are extraordinarily rare because rope is organic and on land it disappears almost immediately. In the harbour silt, it lasts. The fibres of a rope that tied an ancient Egyptian ship to a dock in the port of Heracleion are still identifiable under a microscope. They came from papyrus, or esparto grass, or date palm, the fibrous plants of the Nile Delta region, twisted and braided into the rope that the city's ships needed to function. The colossal statues recovered from the harbour of Alexandria are each, individually, works of art of the first order. But they are also evidence of the scale of the royal quarter, of the ambition of the Ptolemaic programme of self-representation, of the visual language with which the Ptolemaic rulers presented themselves to their subjects and to the world. A colossal statue of a pharaoh standing at the harbour entrance is a statement in the most literal sense. It says, in the universal language of size and stone, here is the ruler of this kingdom. These statues were not decoration, they were assertion. The statue lying on the harbour floor, the torso in red granite, 5 metres of a man who was presented as a god, says something different. It says, and here is where that assertion ended. Not as accusation, not as tragedy in the moral sense, simply as fact. The assertion was made. The stone that carried it was carved and polished and erected at the harbour entrance, where every arriving ship would see it. The stone is still there. The assertion is still there, in the stone. The harbour entrance is now a harbour floor. These things are all true simultaneously. What all the objects have in common, the sphinx and the anchor stock and the coin and the rope and the ceramic shard and the bronze figurine and the seed grain in the storage jar and the fish bone in the kitchen midden, is that they are still speaking. In the silence of the harbour floor for centuries, for millennia, they have been holding their information intact, waiting for someone with the right questions to come and listen. The waiting had its own patience, the patience of matter, which does not know time the way living things know time, which simply exists in whatever state it has been left in until something changes. The divers with their cameras and their maps and their careful hands are that something, the change after all this time, is arriving. There is a category of find from Thonis-Heracleion that has received less attention than the dramatic objects, the sphinxes, the colossal statues, the inscribed stelae, but that may be more revealing of the ordinary life of the city than any of them. These are the small votive objects, the tiny bronze figurines, the faience amulets, the small stone vessels, the fragments of pottery used in ritual, that were deposited in and around the temple complex in enormous numbers over the centuries of the city's occupation. Votive offerings are objects given to the gods in exchange for assistance or in fulfillment of a vow. You ask the god for something: healing from an illness, safe passage on a voyage, success in a business venture, the birth of a healthy child, and if the god delivered, you made an offering in return. The offering was typically small because most people were not wealthy, and the convention of votive giving was designed to accommodate people at all economic levels. A wealthy merchant might give a gold figurine, a sailor might give a small bronze boat, a farmer might give a clay model of the animal whose health he had prayed for, a woman might give a small figure of the goddess associated with childbirth. The collection of votive objects from the sanctuary at Thonis-Heracleion spans the entire period of the city's occupation and represents an extraordinary cross-section of the population that used the sanctuary. Greek figurines in the conventions of Greek votive practice lie alongside Egyptian figurines in the conventions of Egyptian votive practice. Objects that were brought by ship's captains from their home ports in Greece, or Cyprus, or the Levant sit in the same deposit as objects made by local Egyptian craftsmen. The god of the harbour received offerings from everyone who passed through it, and the offerings reflect the diversity of the people who came. There is a small bronze figurine from the sanctuary that has stayed with me since I first read the description of it. It is a figure of a man, a worshipper, standing in the conventional pose of reverence, his arms at his sides or raised in supplication, his face turned toward whatever image of the god he was standing before. He's not large, perhaps 10 centimeters high. He's not elaborately made. The bronze casting is competent but not exceptional, the kind of thing a craftsman turned out in quantities for the sanctuary souvenir trade. He has been in the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion for 2,500 years. He is a specific person, or rather he was made to represent a specific person, someone who came to the temple at Heracleion and made a vow, and came back when the vow was fulfilled and left this small bronze figure as a record of the transaction. We do not know who he was. We do not know what he asked for or received. We do not know whether he was Greek or Egyptian, or from somewhere else entirely. But he was there. He stood in the temple court where the sanctuary of Amun-Gereb stood, with this small figure in his hand, and he set it down and he walked away, and the figure stayed, and the city went under, and the figure went under with it, and the silt covered it, and 2,500 years later, a diver with a light found it lying in the mud. What does it mean to find something like that? Not in the grand sense, not in the sense of what it contributes to our understanding of ancient religious practice or trade network or material culture, in the small sense, in the human sense. A person stood in that temple. They cared about something enough to ask a god for it. They received whatever they received or did not receive it, and came back either way. And now a diver is holding the small bronze figure that person left behind in cold water 30 feet below the surface, in a harbour that has been under the sea for 15 centuries. The specific gravity of that, the particularity, the smallness, the intimacy of it, is something that the grand narrative of lost civilizations cannot quite contain. Human memory has a particular relationship with catastrophe. Events that are merely difficult, a dry year, a political upheaval, a change of dynasty, tend to fade over generations, absorbed into the broader texture of history, losing their sharp edges, becoming background colour in a story that is mostly about other things. But events that are sudden and total, that involve the complete transformation of a landscape or a way of life that people knew and depended on, those events leave marks in cultural memory that are much more durable. They become stories, they become warnings, they become myths, and myths, unlike history, travel without requiring a continuous chain of documentation. They survive in the places where documents perish. They are the cockroaches of human knowledge, resilient, opportunistic, nearly impossible to fully exterminate. The flooding of coastal lands, the sea taking what people had built on its shore, appears in the mythologies and oral traditions of peoples all over the world, on every coastline where the sea has encroached on inhabited territory over the past 12,000 years. This is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of the fact that the sea has been rising for 12,000 years, and coastal peoples around the world have been watching it take their land for 12,000 years, and the experience of watching the sea take the land, the shock of it, the grief of it, the way a familiar landscape becomes an underwater landscape in the space of a human lifetime or two, is an experience that demands to be remembered. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been shown, in work by linguist Patrick Nunn and colleague Nicholas Reed, to preserve accounts of landscape changes that appear to correspond to events during the post-Ice Age sea level rise, which concluded roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. These accounts describe bays and islands that now exist where dry land existed before, changes that occurred gradually over centuries, but that were dramatic enough on the human scale to be worth recording and passing down. If these interpretations are correct, Aboriginal Australian oral tradition has preserved accurate geographical information for 7,000 to 8,000 years, a feat of cultural memory with no parallel in any other tradition. The Norse tradition has stories of coastal lands swallowed by the sea, stories from the Pacific Islands, the cultures that spread across the largest ocean in the world in the most extraordinary maritime expansion in human history, carry the trace of remembered flooding, of islands that were there and then were not there, of the sea level changing within the memory of the tradition. Stories from the indigenous peoples of the American Pacific coast describe mountains of water coming from the sea, which matches the oral record of specific tsunamis that geological evidence now confirms occurred in the last 2,000 years. The most famous version of this archetype in the Western tradition is Atlantis, the great island civilization that, in Plato's telling, sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophe. Plato placed it in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, 9,000 years before his own time. Almost nothing in that description is straightforwardly accurate, neither the location nor the time, and possibly not the scale. But the story Plato told, a powerful, advanced civilization brought low by disaster and sent beneath the waves, is one of the most enduring in the Western tradition, and it is hard not to read it as a distilled, mythologized version of something that was actually experienced on the coasts of the ancient Mediterranean during and before Plato's lifetime. Plato was writing in the 4th century BC. By that time, the Minoan civilization of Crete had been gone for 1,000 years, and the memory of its catastrophic end, the eruption of Santorini, the tsunamis, the slow collapse of a Bronze Age world, had been refracted through 1,000 years of Greek oral tradition into something that was no longer history, but was not quite myth either. It was something in between, the memory of a catastrophe, preserved in stories that had been told and retold and modified and elaborated by 100 generations of storytellers who were interested in the meaning of the catastrophe more than in its precise historical details. There is something else in the Atlantis story that connects it to what we have been exploring tonight, and it is not about the Minoan catastrophe at all. It is about the nature of maritime power and its relationship to the sea. Plato's Atlantis was a maritime civilization. Its power came from the sea, from its navy and its trading networks, from its ability to move goods and armies across water. Its capital was built around a system of concentric canals and harbour basins, its architecture oriented toward the sea, and when it fell into the sea. The thing that had made it great was the thing that took it down. Alexandria is a version of this story. Its power came from the sea, from the greatest harbour in the ancient world, from its position at the junction of the Mediterranean trade routes. The royal quarter, now under 30 feet of water in the eastern harbour, was built overlooking the harbour, every important building positioned to command a view of the water, every architectural gesture oriented toward the ships arriving and departing. And when the earthquakes came and the land subsided and the sea level rose, it was the sea that took it first. The medium of the city's power became the medium of the city's burial. Thonis-Heracleion is the same story, distilled even further. A city that existed solely because of its position at the sea's edge, controlling the maritime gateway to Egypt, a city whose entire identity, whose entire reason for existing was its relationship to the water, and that city was destroyed ultimately by the water it had spent 6 centuries controlling. The sea gave, and the sea took back. This is not a moral, or if it is one that resists the simple frameworks that moral stories usually carry. The sea did not punish these cities for their maritime ambitions. The geological processes that took them under were not responses to human behaviour. The earth moved because the earth moves, on schedules that do not take human civilization into account. The sea rose because the ice melted, because the climate changed, because planetary processes that began long before the first human city was built continued on their own timetable, regardless of what was built on the shores in their path. And yet the human response to these events, the way they have been remembered, mythologized, turned into stories about the fragility of human ambition and the implacability of natural forces, is real and interesting and worth taking seriously. The myths that coastal peoples around the world have preserved about the sea, taking the land, are not failed science. They are not primitive misunderstandings of geological processes that we now understand correctly. They are something more like the emotional truth of the experience, the accurate recording of what it felt like to lose a world, to watch something that had been solid and permanent and present become water, to carry the memory of a place that no one living had seen, but that the old stories insisted was real. The legend of Atlantis became, over the 2,000 years since Plato wrote it down, something far more elaborate than what Plato described. Each generation added details, moved the location, identified new candidates for the lost civilization. In the Middle Ages, Atlantis was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps the Canary Islands or the Azores or the coasts of Spain. In the 19th century, the American politician Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book called Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, that argued with great enthusiasm and considerable disregard for evidence that Atlantis was the source of all human civilization, the origin of every mythology and every technological tradition across the world. The book sold enormously. It was followed by dozens of others, each one more elaborate than the last, each one finding Atlantis in a new location with new evidence. Antarctica, the Bahamas, the floor of the Mediterranean itself, the floor of the Atlantic. None of these books is archaeology. They are something else, a cultural phenomenon, a recurring human desire to believe in a lost golden age, a time before the fall, a civilization more advanced than ours that was destroyed before it could save us from ourselves. This desire is understandable. It is, in its way, beautiful. The idea that somewhere under the water, the wisdom of the ancient world is waiting to be recovered, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed it. What archaeologists have found is both less dramatic and more real than Atlantis. The Sphinx in the Eastern Harbour is not the remnant of a lost golden age. It is a piece of Ptolemaic statuary, made in the 2nd or 1st century BC, lying in 12 feet of water because the ground beneath it subsided and the sea rose and no one came to retrieve it. The walls of Thonis-Heracleion are not the walls of a perfect civilization. They are the walls of a city that did what cities do: grew, traded, worshipped its gods, argued about politics, accommodated the rich and exploited the poor, built and maintained and eventually lost the structures that made its life possible, and then went under the water, like every coastal city eventually goes under the water, given enough time and enough geological patience. The truth is both smaller and larger than the myth. Smaller because there is no lost wisdom, no secret technology, no divine knowledge preserved in the ruins. Larger because what is preserved is real. The actual physical residue of the actual lives of actual people who lived in these places and built these things and used these objects, and then went away and left them behind for the sea to keep. The myth promises a perfect world lost. The archaeology delivers a real world preserved. The real world is more interesting. It is more complicated, more specific, more human. It has anchor stocks with merchants' names in the lead. It has seeds in storage jars. It has the marks of ancient tool use in ancient stone. That is what the sea has kept, not the Golden Age, the actual thing. There is a particular grief that attaches to the idea of something lost before it was properly known. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example of this in the Western tradition. The idea that the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world was gathered in one place and then lost, and that what we know of the ancient world is only a fraction of what the ancients knew. This idea is powerful enough to have survived 2,000 years as a cultural touchstone, surfacing whenever people discuss the fragility of knowledge, the cost of destruction, the irreversibility of certain losses. Whether the library was really destroyed in a single catastrophic event, or whether it declined gradually over centuries, or whether its contents were already partially dispersed before any single disaster, none of this has much diminished the power of the idea. The idea is not really about the library. It is about the feeling that something irreplaceable was taken before it could be fully received. The submerged cities of the Mediterranean produce a similar feeling, and perhaps that is part of what makes them so compelling. Not just Thonis-Heracleion and the royal quarter of Alexandria, but all of them, Baia and Pavlopetri, and the Lycian coastal cities and the Caesarea harbour, and the dozens of sites that have not yet been properly investigated. What they represent is not just the loss of buildings and artefacts, but the loss of ways of life, of social arrangements, of forms of knowledge and practice and daily experience that are not recoverable from texts. The texts that survive from the ancient Mediterranean world are, by their nature, texts, the product of literate people writing about things they considered worth writing about. The lives of fishermen and dock workers and market traders and potters and sailors are present in those texts only obliquely, when the writer mentions them in passing, when they serve as examples or background colour for something the writer considers more important. The physical remains of the submerged cities, the pottery in the harbour floor, the storage vessels in the ruined warehouses, the tools of daily life preserved in the anaerobic silt, are the residue of those unliterary lives. They are what the fishermen and the dockworkers left behind, because what they left behind was not text but things, and things are what the sea has kept. In this sense, the submerged cities are a kind of democratic archive. They have preserved what would not otherwise survive precisely because what survives is not what anyone chose to preserve but what the sea happened to receive. The Atlantis myth has one more layer worth examining, and it is not historical but psychological. The idea of a lost world more advanced than our own, a world that had things we do not have, that understood things we do not understand, that achieved things we cannot achieve, is not unique to Plato or to Western culture. It appears in various forms across many traditions: the Golden Age before the fall, the Paradise before the expulsion, the time before time when things were better, simpler, more whole. These ideas are so widespread that anthropologists and psychologists have proposed various explanations for why they recur, from the theory that they reflect a real cultural memory of a better period in the distant past to the theory that they reflect the universal human experience of childhood when the world was simpler because the child was smaller and did not yet understand its complexity. What the archaeology offers is not a refutation of this feeling but a different relationship to it. The lost cities of the Mediterranean are not the remnants of a more advanced civilization. They are the remnants of a different civilization, one that understood some things better than we do. The hydraulic concrete at Caesarea is more durable than modern concrete. The urban planning of Alexandria was more sophisticated than most cities managed for centuries afterward. And some things less well. They had no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no way to prevent the deaths of children from diseases that are now trivial. They are not better. They are not worse. They are simply different, and they are real. That reality, the specific, detailed, archaeologically verifiable reality of these places, is, I think, more interesting than the myth. The anchor stock with the merchant's name in the lead is more interesting than Atlantis. Not because it is more dramatic, but because it is more true. It connects us to an actual person, in an actual place, in an actual moment in history. It says, this person was here, this is what they left, and the sea has kept it, for anyone who goes looking, for as long as the cold and the dark remain. The thing about underwater archaeology that is genuinely different from almost every other field of human inquiry is that the work has barely begun. Not the methodology. The methodology is well developed, refined over 60 years of practice in increasingly challenging environments. Not the technology. The technology is sophisticated and improving year by year, each new tool opening possibilities that were not available a decade before. But the actual work of systematic survey, the examination of the coastal and nearshore waters of the world's seas and oceans to find what is there, to map it, to document it, to begin to understand what the sea has preserved, that work is in its earliest stages. What we know about what is under the Mediterranean, the result of targeted investigations at specific sites, driven by specific questions and specific historical hints, is likely a small fraction, perhaps a very small fraction, of what is actually there. Goddio's surveys in Alexandria, Thonis-Heracleion, and elsewhere are the result of years of careful historical research identifying priority sites, followed by years of systematic underwater investigation. The gaps between the investigated sites are vast, and nothing is known about what lies in those gaps. Other sites may be discoverable, other cities may be findable, other harbours may have gone under that no ancient text mentions and no modern researcher has thought to look for. The excavation in Alexandria is ongoing. Every year, Goddio's institute brings divers back to the eastern harbour and finds things. In recent seasons, the work has continued to map the harbour floor in increasing detail, identifying structural remains that had not been recognised in earlier surveys, recovering objects whose context, the exact position, the surrounding material, the stratigraphy, adds new information to the interpretation of the site as a whole. The site is not exhausted, the evidence is not finished. After nearly 30 years of work, the team estimates they have investigated perhaps a third of the submerged royal quarter. The remaining 2/3 is still there, still in the silt, still holding its objects and its structures and its potential answers. One of the more intriguing recent directions of the Alexandria work involves the commercial district of the submerged city, the area outside the royal quarter, the working harbour zone where the real business of the port was conducted. The great harbour of Alexandria was not just a royal harbour, not just a place for the Ptolemaic navy and the state's grain fleet. It was a commercial harbour, crowded with private merchant vessels, lined with warehouses where goods in transit were stored, busy with the small boats and the shore workers that any major port requires. That commercial infrastructure is also underwater, also in the silt, also accessible to divers with the right equipment and the right questions. It has been less thoroughly investigated than the royal quarter, and this is understandable, because the palace of Cleopatra commands attention in a way that a warehouse does not. But the warehouse may be more informative in some respects than the palace. The palace tells you about power and its self-presentation. The warehouse tells you about how the economy actually worked, what goods moved through the harbour, in what quantities, from where to where, at what periods. The commercial district of submerged Alexandria may, when it is properly investigated, add more to the history of ancient Mediterranean trade than anything yet recovered from the royal quarter. At Thonis-Heracleion, the most recent work has focused on two areas: the residential districts of the ancient city and the deeper exploration of the harbour zone around the main temple complex. The residential surveys are yielding evidence of the ordinary life of the city, the kind of evidence that is always the hardest to find and the most valuable to have. Domestic pottery, cooking equipment, the debris of daily meals, small objects that people kept in their houses, amulets, personal ornaments, tools, the kinds of things that people keep close and that therefore tell you something personal about the people who kept them. The harbour zone has yielded a discovery announced in 2021 that received less attention than it deserved in the broader press. In the port area of the ancient city, in an area that the team had identified as associated with religious activity, divers found the remains of a Greek-style tumulus, a burial mound, the kind of funerary monument that Greeks built over the graves of important individuals. The tumulus was not a hill above ground. It had been a low mound at ground level, and the subsidence of the city had taken it under along with everything else, and it had been buried in the silt and forgotten. Inside the tumulus were remains of funerary offerings in the Hellenistic Greek tradition: alabaster vessels, bronze vessels, gold objects, amethysts, carnelian beads. The whole assemblage dated to the 5th century BC, contemporary with Herodotus, who may have visited this city and whose description of it is one of the few ancient references we have. The person buried in that tumulus, whoever they were, was important enough to receive a Greek-style monumental burial in the harbour district of one of the most important ports in the ancient world. They were probably not Egyptian. The Greek burial style suggests a Greek merchant or official, someone who had come to Thonis-Heracleion from the Greek world and had lived and died there, far from home. The offerings in their grave were expensive, suggesting wealth accumulated in trade. The location of the grave in the harbour district suggests a life spent close to the water, close to the ships, in the commercial world of the port. We will never know their name, we will never know where they came from in the Greek world, or what cargo their ships carried, or how long they lived in Heracleion, or whether they had a family in Greece that they thought of in the evenings, or what they made of the Egyptian world that surrounded them. But we know they were there. We know they were important enough to be buried with some ceremony. We know the silt kept them, and kept what was placed in the ground with them for 2,500 years. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal. At Pavlopetri, ongoing analysis of the material recovered in the 2009 and subsequent survey seasons continues to refine the understanding of the site. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from different parts of the site is building up a more detailed chronology of when different areas were occupied and when they were abandoned. The picture that is emerging is of a site with a longer and more continuous history of occupation than earlier surveys had suggested, not a town that was suddenly abandoned around 1000 BC, but a community that had been using and reusing the site for perhaps 2,000 years before the final submergence, with periods of more and less intensive occupation corresponding to the broader rhythms of the Bronze Age Aegean. There are sites around the Mediterranean that have been identified from aerial photography or satellite imagery, or systematic sonar survey, identified as likely archaeological sites, documented in databases, awaiting investigation, but that have not yet been studied by divers. Some of them are in waters that are politically inaccessible. Some are in waters that are physically dangerous or too deep for current technology. Some are simply waiting for the next research program and the next funding cycle and the next group of researchers with the specific combination of historical knowledge and technical capability that this kind of work requires. There is a site off the northern coast of Cyprus that some researchers believe may be the location of the ancient city of Alasia, the Bronze Age copper-producing city whose name appears in Egyptian diplomatic correspondence from the 14th and 13th centuries BC, and whose location on land has never been conclusively identified. Alasia was, in that period, one of the most important suppliers of copper in the eastern Mediterranean, and copper was, in the Bronze Age, one of the most important commodities in the world, the primary component of the bronze that gave the age its name. If Alasia is underwater, and if it has been preserved in the same cold anaerobic conditions that have preserved Thonis-Heracleion and the royal quarter of Alexandria, the implications for our understanding of the Bronze Age trade network, how copper moved, who controlled it, how the earliest international trade system actually functioned, would be significant. The systematic survey of the Mediterranean coastal zone that would resolve questions like this has not yet been done. It would require resources and coordination across multiple national jurisdictions that are not currently assembled. But the technology for doing it exists. The historical questions that would motivate it are clear. The evidence from the sites that have already been investigated that the effort would be rewarded, that the sea has preserved things worth finding, is overwhelming. What we know for certain is this: the sea preserves better than the land. The conditions that destroy organic material on land are absent or greatly reduced in the cold, anaerobic, undisturbed environment of the seabed. What went into the water in good condition has, in many cases, remained in good condition. Wood that would have rotted in a century on land has survived for millennia. Rope has survived. Seeds have survived. The record of human life that has been lost from the land surface, burned in fires, destroyed by war, dissolved by rain and soil acids, and the metabolism of the organisms that break down organic matter, is not necessarily gone. It may simply be somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark and still, waiting. This is the largest meaning of what the whole enterprise of underwater archaeology has demonstrated. Not just the recovery of the palace of Cleopatra, not just the documentation of the lost lighthouse, not just the identification of a forgotten port city in the waters of Abu Qir Bay. What has been demonstrated is that the sea is an archive, a vast, cold, imperfect, extraordinary archive of what the land has lost, and we are just beginning, with the tools we now have and the knowledge we are accumulating, to read it. The next Sphinx is still down there, the next anchor stock with its merchant's name is still down there, the next colossal statue in red granite, the next naos in black granite, the next street laid out in the careful geometry of a town that was ordinary and important and real. All of it is down there, in the dark, in the cold, waiting, as things in the dark and the cold wait, without urgency, without impatience, without awareness of waiting, simply being what they are, in the place they came to rest until something comes to find them. There is a practical argument for investing more resources in underwater archaeology that is rarely made, but that is in some ways the most compelling. The sites are degrading, not quickly, not dramatically. The cold and the anaerobic conditions protect them far better than any land environment would. But they are not static. The harbour of Alexandria has boat traffic that disturbs the sediment. The site at Abu Qir Bay is in waters subject to trawling. Pavlopetri is in a popular tourist area, and recreational diving and snorkeling, however well-intentioned, gradually disturb the surface archaeology. The sites are surviving, but they are not perfectly preserved, and the rate of survival is not constant. Climate change adds another dimension to this concern. The sea level is rising again, faster than it has in many centuries, as the remaining ice sheets melt and the warming ocean expands. Coastal sites that are currently in very shallow water, sites like Pavlopetri in 3 to 4 meters, are at risk of being disturbed by the increasing intensity of storm waves that come with rising seas and warming temperatures. The sediment that covers and protects the archaeological material can be moved by storm waves that penetrate the shallows more forcefully as the sea level rises and the water depth increases. The protection that relative stability has provided for 3,000 years may not be guaranteed for another 3,000. The scientists who monitor the volcanic activity beneath Santorini are also relevant here. The volcanic system beneath the Aegean, not just Santorini but the broader Hellenic volcanic arc, a chain of volcanic centres running from the Greek mainland through the Aegean islands and into the eastern Mediterranean, is not dormant. It is active, producing earthquakes regularly and occasionally producing more significant events. The 2011 to 2012 episode of Unrest at Santorini, when the ground swelled and small earthquakes rattled the island for several months, was a reminder that the geological processes that took these cities under are still operating. A future earthquake along the eastern Mediterranean fault system could disturb the harbour floor of Alexandria, scatter the silt-covered remains of the royal quarter, damage objects that have survived intact for 15 centuries. This is not a likely event on any short timescale, but it is a reminder that the archive is not permanent. Against all of this, there is the ongoing work. The divers go down every year, the sonar maps grow more detailed, the laboratory analyses yield new information, the interpretive frameworks become more sophisticated as more evidence accumulates. The pace is slow, as it must be, but the direction is clear. We know more about the submerged cities of the Mediterranean than we did a decade ago, and we will know more in a decade than we do now. The archive is being read. The reading is going well. What would it mean to have a complete picture of the submerged Mediterranean? Not just the sites that have been investigated, but all of them. Every coastal city that went under, every harbour that subsided, every Bronze Age settlement that the sea level rise swallowed in the millennia after the last ice age. The picture would be of an ancient world far more extensively settled on its coastlines than the land-based archaeological record reveals. It would show the full extent of the Bronze Age trade network, not just the parts whose remains happen to be on dry land. It would show the long history of human settlement at the land-sea boundary, the original environment of our species as a coastal creature, the environment that shaped our relationship to the sea and to the resources it provides. That picture is being assembled slowly by the people who do this work. Each new site adds a piece. Each new object from an investigated site adds a detail. Each new analysis of a recovered object adds a nuance. The picture is far from complete. It may never be complete. The sea is large, the coastlines are long, and the resources available for this kind of archaeology are finite. But it is growing, and the growing of it is one of the most interesting intellectual projects of our time. The Sphinx on the harbour floor of Alexandria is a piece of that picture. The anchor stock with the merchant's name is a piece of that picture. The streets of Pavlopetri, visible through 3 meters of clear water, are a piece of that picture. The naus in the collapsed sanctuary of Thonis-Heracleion, inscribed with its ancient Egyptian texts, is a piece of that picture. Each piece is real, specific, datable, interpretable. Each piece is a gift from the past that the sea has kept for us, held carefully in the cold and the dark against the day when we would have the tools and the knowledge and the will to go and find it. Somewhere in the eastern harbour of Alexandria the water moves. Not much. The harbour is sheltered, and the night brings a particular stillness to it. The boat traffic stills, the wind drops. The low chop that troubled the surface during the day settles into something barely perceptible. A slow breathing in and out as the tidal current moves through the harbour entrance and carries its sediment in gentle suspension through the dark water. The water moves. It always moves. Even in its stillest moments the sea is in motion, the tide drawing it out and bringing it back, the thermohaline currents running their slow circuits through the harbour, the infinitesimally slow drift of the silt particles that are always, on some scale, settling or being resuspended, the perpetual gentle conversation between the water and the bottom. On the floor nothing moves. The Sphinx lies where it has lain for 1,500 years, its face turned toward a darkness that is the same darkness it has known since the water rose over it, and the light left, and the years began to accumulate above it like a kind of silt. The column bases are exactly where they were placed 2,000 years ago, by workmen who had names and families, and who had no idea that the ground they were building on would one day be 20 feet below the surface of the harbour. The marble pavement, the floor of a room that a queen once crossed, sits in the silt, in the dark, in the cold, holding the memory of footsteps in the only way that stone can hold a memory, by being itself unchanged in the place where the footsteps fell. There is no sound here except the water, no voice, no ship, no wind. The sound the water makes at this depth in this harbour is not silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and the harbour floor is not quite silent. There is the very faint movement of the current over stone. There is the settling of the silt, which is not audible exactly, but which is a kind of presence, a kind of texture in the quiet. There is the pressure of the water, which is a physical thing, a weight, a gentle and continuous insistence. The stones live in this sound, they have lived in it for a long time. Above the harbour floor the city of Alexandria goes on, 5 million people, streets that are loud in the day and quieter at night but never quite silent. The harbour lit with the running lights of ships, container ships, tankers, ferries, fishing boats, their lights reflecting on the water in columns of broken colour. The ordinary life of an enormous modern city pressing on across the surface of the history underneath it, as ordinary life always presses on, as ordinary life must press on, because ordinary life is what life mostly is, and there is no shame in that. And underneath it, in the dark and the cold, the ancient world waits, patient, complete, holding what it has held since the earthquakes came and the land subsided and the sea rose over the royal quarter. The sphinxes lay down in the harbour, and the palaces filled with water, and the lights went out one by one in the rooms where the last Ptolemaic queen had lived her long, complicated life. It is not a sad waiting. There is nothing sad about what is under the water, not really. The stones are not in distress. The marble floor is not grieving. What is under the water is under the water, and the water holds it with the same indifference with which the water holds everything. The same quality of care it gives to the anchor stocks and the coins and the rope and the seeds and the fish bones and the inscribed stelae and the colossal torso in red granite. Everything receives the same treatment. Everything is held in the same cold dark. There is a democracy in it that has a kind of comfort. Let the tension in your body go now, not all at once, just whatever you're holding that you don't need to hold. Your shoulders, your jaw, the small clutch of effort that stays in your hands even when your hands are still. Let those go. They will be here when you need them again. They do not need to be held right now. Somewhere off the coast of southern Greece, in the shallow clear water of Vatica Bay, Pavlopetri is sleeping its 5,000-year sleep. The streets are there in the sunlight that reaches them through 3 meters of water. The walls are there, still tracing the rooms where families lived in the 3rd millennium BC. The building that may have been a meeting hall is there, its long walls fallen to their foundation courses, its plan still readable if you know how to look. The town is at the bottom of the bay, and the bay is at the bottom of the Aegean, and the Aegean is at the bottom of the sky, and all of it is in the same night that is in you now, breathing in and breathing out, your chest rising and falling in the same slow rhythm that the sea has always kept. In the bay of Abukir, in the waters that were once the mouth of the Nile where the delta met the sea, Thonis-Heracleion rests on the seafloor. The temple of Amun-Gereb with its scattered columns lying where the earthquakes put them, each column a sentence in a language that has to be read from the air, or from a boat, or in the mind of a researcher who has spent years learning to see the structure in the scattered stones. The harbour, full of anchor stocks with merchants' names in the lead, names of people who came to this harbour from Greece and Cyprus and the Levant, and dropped anchor and set off across the city to make their deals and pay their dues and sail away. The tumulus in the harbour district, with its alabaster and its gold and its unknown Greek merchant buried far from home. All of it there, all of it quiet. You can let go now. Not of everything, not of the things that matter, not of the people you love, not of the day you'll have tomorrow, just of the grip, the effort of being awake, of processing, of maintaining the tension that wakefulness requires. That can go. The way a stone settles into silt when the water finally becomes still, without effort, without intention, without doing anything at all except being what it is and letting the quiet receive it. The Pharos burned for 15 centuries. It guided its ships, served its sailors, stood at the harbour entrance in all weathers and all seasons, its fire visible 50 miles out to sea on a clear night, its smoke visible by day, its white walls brilliant in the Egyptian sun. And then it fell, slowly, earthquake by earthquake, stone by stone over 4 centuries. And the stones went into the water, and the water received them. The inscription that Sostratus carved into the foundation stones, the inscription he covered with plaster so that the pharaoh's name would be visible first, and that the plaster would eventually wear away to reveal, that inscription is in the stones that are on the harbour floor. Whether it is legible, whether the water and the centuries have left the letters readable, is something only a diver with a light and time could tell you. But the words are there, or they were there when the stones were cut, and what the words say is this: To the saviour gods, on behalf of those who sail the seas. On behalf of those who sail the seas, on behalf of everyone who has ever needed the light, the merchant coming in from a long voyage, the sailor navigating in the dark, the person who has been far from shore and needs to know where the harbour is. The Pharos was built for them. It burned for 15 centuries on their behalf. And then it went into the water, and the water kept it. And in the morning, a diver will go down. The light from the surface will change as it moves through the water, from sunlight to something softer, something diffuse and blue, something that moves in patterns across the harbour floor like the memory of light. The diver will move slowly through the cold water, their breath making small sounds in the regulator, their light illuminating the silt and the stone, and they will see something that has been there for 1,000 years, or for 1,500 years, or for 2,000 years, something waiting. The sea holds what it holds, the dark holds what is given to the dark, and everything that was real is still real, somewhere, in the cold and the quiet, in the patience of stone and water and silt, waiting for the light to find it again. Sleep now. The harbour is still. The ancient world is exactly where it was. The sphinxes are looking at the harbour floor with the same expression they have always had. Serene, attentive, not waiting for anything because they do not know about waiting, because they are stone and stone does not know about time the way living things know about time. They are simply there, in the dark, in the cold, as they have always been, as they will be, for a long time yet. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And here's the question I keep coming back to. If you could spend 1 week anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world we've been exploring tonight, walking the streets of Alexandria at its height, sailing into the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion, or living in the Bronze Age town of Pavlopetri before the water came, which would you choose, and what would you most want to see? I read every comment. Leave it below. The water in the harbour moves in very small amounts tonight. The current that runs through the eastern harbour entrance is slow and cold, the same current that has been running through this entrance since before the Ptolemies built their palace, since before Alexander walked this shore and imagined what could be built here. The tidal pull is gentle. The water barely moves, but it moves. The Sphinx is not aware of the movement. The Sphinx is not aware of anything. It is stone, and stone does not have awareness in the way that living things do, and the conditions under which we sometimes attribute awareness to stone. The mood of a particular evening, the weight of a particular historical imagination, do not change what the Sphinx actually is. What the Sphinx actually is a piece of carved limestone made in the 2nd or 1st century BC by a craftsman who knew how to cut stone into the form that the Ptolemaic visual vocabulary required, set up in a place where it was meant to be seen by people approaching the palace by sea, seen from the water, announced the royal world beyond. It is a beautiful object. It is a durable object. It has outlasted everyone who made it and everyone who ever saw it in its original context by 2,000 years, and it is stone. There is a freedom in this fact that is worth accepting before you sleep. The ancient world does not need your attention tonight. The Sphinx in the harbour does not need to be thought about. Thonis-Heracleion does not need to be worried over. The sights are where they are, in the dark and the cold and the still water, and they will be there tomorrow and next year and in a century, patiently holding what they have always held, waiting without impatience for the next diver with the next light. The world you will wake up in tomorrow is the world that exists above all of this, the sunlit world, the world of ordinary time, the world where things need to be done and people need to be seen, and life needs to be lived. That world will be waiting for you. It is always waiting. You do not need to hold it now. Let the harbour hold it. The harbour is good at holding things. It has been doing it for a very long time. The depth below you is real. The cold is real. The stone is real. The dark water that moved over the palace floors and the temple courts and the streets of the lost cities is real, and it is doing what it has always done, holding, preserving, keeping the weight of the past in a place where the present cannot reach it. This is the nature of deep time. This is what it means for something to be ancient, not gone, held, somewhere else, in the cold and the dark, exactly as real as it was the day it went under waiting for the light. You're in the light, or you were, until the night came, and your eyes closed, and the light became the dark behind your eyelids, and now the dark is also yours, the same dark that the Sphinx knows, the same cold, the same quiet, the same patience. Everything that needs to be preserved will be preserved. Everything that needs to be held will be held. The water knows how to do this. The silt knows how to do this. And you know how to do this too. How to be still. How to let the noise settle. How to let the day's sediment drift down through the water until it rests at the bottom, and the water above it is clear. Sleep now. The harbour is still. The Sphinx is in the dark. The ancient world is exactly where it was.